I think solitary reading is about as bad an addiction as solitary drinking. One should drink with others, and one should read with others as well. Because you don't really find out what you've done with your mind unless you and somebody else, your wife or somebody else, your friends, have read the same book and you and they discuss it. The role of discussion, of conversation about serious matters, books read, discussed seriously and well, is the most fruitful of all the forms by which one grows up and one hopes becomes educated. Thank you very much.
Assalamu alaikum and welcome back to the Adab Book Club. We're back for our weekly reading of Ibn Khaldun's Muqaddimah. As always, if you'd like to participate in the future sessions, you can join the Telegram page where you'll have daily interaction and also direct invitations for future live sessions such as these. Details are in the description box below. So today is going to be a very interesting session. I mean, they always are. I think the interaction is very, very valuable and we get to learn a lot from Ibn Khaldun's Muqaddimah. It's always relevant to the current state of the world as it is today. So we get to not only learn about the past, but also get insights for the future and for the present. So we've discussed many things. I think spirituality was very interesting. Also, the world of sorcery and the occult was interesting. We discussed sedentary lifestyles. We covered various elements of living, the human society, and so on and so forth. Today we're going to deal with a very touchy topic, and a topic that really has divided the Muslim world for the longest time. And it continues to divide us today, actually. It's the issue of leadership, rulers, power, and how to approach power, how to interact with power, and how to also maneuver and manipulate power. So this is Ibn Khaldun's, you could say, speciality. Ibn Khaldun, as we know, wears many hats. He's a historian, sociologist, scholar, jurist, traveler. He's also a very acute and shrewd politician, power politician. Power politics and power politicians, as we know, are oftentimes difficult topics to delve into, especially within the Muslim world. Because the assumption is if you talk about these principles and rules that you are somehow advocating for them and endorsing them. And that's not what we're doing here. We're not advocating or endorsing anything. We're just exploring and unpacking the information Ibn Khaldun gives us. And he is really well placed, actually, to impart upon us his knowledge. Very well placed. In the introduction to a very brief book on the Umayyads, I forget the name of the author, but it's a very, very brief book on the Umayyad kingdom. The introduction has a foreword by Dr. Abdul Samad Clark. Dr. Abdul Samad Clark. And in that preface, he talks to us about how complicated the world really is and how simple-minded people always go for what he calls a Manichaean dichotomy. Yeah? That they have like a Zoroastrian worldview. It's either black or white. So he calls these people children. Effectively, they have childish mentalities. They don't have the ability to look at things from a broader perspective. It's either good or bad, black or white, dark or light. So he calls these people who have a very childish, underdeveloped mentality to the world. Then he cites Ibn Khaldun. Out of the blue, he says Ibn Khaldun is a historian, sociologist, political scientist, and a man who studied the world, is the best person to go to when it comes to understanding the reality of power, society, and human, you could say, political engagement. And he says there is a reason why Ibn Khaldun is the best person for this. Although we've had many, many great scholars in the past and historians, Ibn Khaldun is one of the few people who combines not only the history of Islam as a subject, but also the reality of power, the reality of established power. So he talks from a position of experience rather than principle. This is the problem for many of us. We look at history, we look at when we open a book about the Khulafa Rashidun, about the Umayyads, the Ottomans, the Abbasids, the Seljuk, and all the other, the Mughal emperors. And oftentimes you have one or two reactions. One being that they were so great, there was never any problem. They never made any mistakes. Everything was always perfect. or the opposite. They were so evil, they never did anything good. So it's either black or white. It's a very simplistic way to look at the world, quite frankly. Even today, if you look at the 51 Muslim majority nations on earth, they're not perfect. They're not perfect, okay? But we fall into the trap of either condemning them altogether or making them to be the perfect, you could say, paradigm of Islamic society. But in between that, there's a lot of space for mistakes here and there, people who are rulers but are not necessarily the best people. But at the same time, they do good things, right? So Ibn Khaldun, because his entire career was a political career, where he got to work under various administrations in North Africa, in Egypt, and even briefly for people such as Timur and rulers also in Andalusia. So he worked under various powerful people and administrations. And when he writes in this Muqaddimah about the nature of power, it may come across as being almost Machiavellian in the way he writes about power and how to approach power. But it's actually a very realist perspective on power. And this is something that I think somebody reading the Muqaddimah in 2025 can benefit from, because oftentimes if you're reading the books of religious law, if you're reading the Sharia from a perspective of instruction, then certainly you're going to come across injunctions that tell you to be a good person, to be a good ruler, to establish justice in the land. That's what the Sharia is about. It's about guidance. It gives you guidance, what you should do. It's prescriptive. But the reality when you open the books of history is very different. As our brother just said, now let's talk about the Battle of Siffin. The Battle of Siffin is not an instruction manual for how Muslims should behave. The Battle of Siffin in history is actually an account of actually what happened. And sometimes what has happened is not going to match to what should happen. And so Ibn Khaldun is not telling you what should happen, it's telling you what is happening in his world. So as we discuss and explore this fascinating topic, keep that in mind. He's not telling you in all cases you should do it, but he's saying this is what is done, this is what works, and this is what effectively are the rules of power, whether you like it or not. So that having been said, the topic today is entitled The Principles of Power. And this will be a 3-part series. There is so much to talk about here. There is so much. At some parts we will agree with Ibn Khaldun, and in other parts we will disagree with him entirely. Some of the means and methods he seeks to employ are, quite frankly, unprincipled and almost unethical. Dare I say un-Islamic, but he puts them out there. What we can learn from this is, first of all, the nature of power. To understand the nature of power, what it takes to be in power, to maintain power, and sometimes what people will do for power. Okay, it's not always because somebody is a Muslim ruler that he's going to abide by the laws that Islam has prescribed for a Muslim ruler. It's not always the case. You could imagine, of all the rulers we've ever had in the history of Islam, potentially 2%, 3%, maximum 5% were playing it by the rules. Were playing it by the rules in the Quran and Sunnah, and they did what was told to them to do as rulers. The rest of them had their own rules, quite frankly. So they did what had to be done to maintain power and to acquire power. So this is the world in which Ibn Khaldun is a specialist. He's a specialist in this world, and he's going to give us some interesting insights. Yeah? So please don't think I'm telling you to do these things as I share this information with you. It's just a reflection of the world he lived in and the society that he thrived in, because that's where he made his career as a political, you could say, a political actor. Now, the issue of power, the topic of power, the topic of how to gain power, how to maintain power, how to cultivate power, how to get authority and how to exercise authority is not new. These are things that you can go as far off as the Far East and you'll find works such as Sun Tzu, The Art of War. Or you can go to Europe, medieval Europe, and you have Machiavelli. He wrote also The Art of War, but also the very famous The Prince. In modern day society in the West, we have the 48 Laws of Power, which is effectively an amalgamation of various different books and theories in one book. But the idea that there is some sort of art to power, that there is a discipline, there is a science for how to get power, is nothing new. This has occupied many, many people in the past and has actually inspired many rulers in the past how to go about maintaining power. And these books, quite frankly, are dangerous books. I'll tell you from the very beginning. They are very dangerous books in the wrong hands. The 48 Laws of Power by Robert Greene was banned in some prisons. Imagine how bad a book has to be banned even in prison. Machiavelli's The Prince, was considered the work of the devil by the church at the time. The church literally just, they considered it the work of the devil. And even if you read the contemporary translations and adaptations, you can see why they would say that, okay? Because it's really dark. This is a manual for how to be effectively a psychopath, a sociopath, by any means necessary to gain power, to maintain power. The problem is, there are people in this world who definitely study these books, who exercise these principles, and who seek to realize the objectives behind these books. These things exist. So Ibn Khaldun is only one out of many authors who have written about these sciences, how to get power, how to exercise power, how to maintain power. And we have to come to terms with that reality. We have to come to terms with that reality. These things are out there, and there are some people who exercise it. Now, I read parts of the 48 Laws of Power out of curiosity. I read it. And again, reading it, skimming through it, immediately I realized this is definitely a very dangerous book. There's no way to sugarcoat that. It's a dangerous book. But at the same time, it's a book that, if you read it with the right intention, it can be beneficial to you. It gives you the ability to understand how other people think and to take away the naivete that everyone thinks or acts upon good principles. Not everybody in this world acts upon good principles. And this book has really revealed a lot of that. So these are dangerous topics. But unfortunately, we live in a world where there are good people and bad people. And in the same way good people read good books to become better people, there are not so good people who read other books to become other people. So for every person who reads the Quran or the Bible or the Torah or whichever book that inspires us to be honest, to be kind, to be charitable, there are people reading other books that does the absolute opposite. Okay, so these are examples of that here. Power, we have very famous quotes about power because it's all about power at the end of the day. In fact, history as a discipline, it is said to be nothing more than a biography, a collection of biographies of powerful men. If you have to summarize history as a science, as a discipline, in one sentence, it is a collection of biographies of powerful men. That's all history is about. It's all about power and powerful men. So we have quotes such as, all power tends to corrupt, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. Okay? So power by its very nature corrupts, and the more powerful you become, the more corrupt you're likely to become. Okay? It's just a nature, something that's been observed and attested to by various people in various societies at various times. There's no way around it. All governments suffer a recurring problem. Power attracts pathological personalities, and this is very true. Because it takes certain personality to put themselves forward for leadership and then to maintain power. This is why the Prophet ﷺ said to us, warning us that those who seek leadership are not granted leadership. Anybody who puts themselves forward to be a leader should be deprived of that privilege, because there's a certain mentality that it takes and personality it takes to be in power. And so he says governments, they all suffer a certain problem in that you attract pathological personalities, people who are borderline psychopaths in most cases. And the more psychopathic they are, the more unempathetic they are, the more powerful and the more effective they are to rule. It's just a reality, unfortunately. So if you look at past figures in history, we're going to get through a few examples here. The best, in many cases, the best are those who are the most ruthless, cutthroat, unprincipled, and willing to go the farthest to attain their objectives. So when we talk of power and leaders and rulers, keep that in mind. Keep that in mind. Okay, you're dealing with a different kettle of fish here. You're not dealing with ulama. You're not dealing with awliya. You're not dealing with people who are going to be in the masjid praying overnight. And this is a very small sample, an exception. It's an exception to to a massive rule. The majority of these people are going to be very different personalities, and they think very differently as well. They think very, very differently to us. So it is not that power corrupts, but that it is magnetic to the corruptible. Wonderful. So when you have positions such as, for example, president, king, general, emperor, whatever the position is, it will draw out those people. It's like having a moth and having a light, yeah, a source of light. They just come to it. They're drawn to it. And this is again one of the wonderful wisdoms in the speech of Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Those who seek power are deprived of the opportunity to be in position. Anybody who actively goes out seeking power should not be given power. Because as this man says, Frank Herbert, it draws those people, it brings them in, they are drawn to that position. So the Prophet ﷺ, what is known in the subhanallah, in fiqh, qawaid al-fiqhiyya, the juristic principles, maxims, sidd al-diraya, that you stop the harm at the very source of it. Yeah? And the source when it comes to leadership and power is that those who want these things are the most dangerous. So if somebody puts themselves in a position of leadership or power, you should try to keep them away, because they're already showing you early warning signs as who they are. So these are things that have been attested to again the world over. It's not strange, it's just known. Okay, for example, if we say that actors, performers are people who are typically very sentimental, very emotional people, musicians, artists, actors are very sentimental, it makes sense because it takes a certain personality to present themselves before the world openly, right? There's a certain element you have to be in that position, to want to be in that position in the first place, to desire that fame, notoriety, and to have these sorts of inspirations and motivations in life. So musicians, for example, artists are very emotional people. They have deep emotions, and they're very unstable as well, very sensitive. That makes sense. Likewise, rulers, people in positions of power. It doesn't have to be a ruler of a country. It can be a CEO, can be an industry leader. They have a certain personality about them, and that's very, very well attested to globally. If you look at the most famous generals, commanders, warriors, emperors in history, many names come to mind, but we can think of the top 10. I guarantee at least 3 of these will come up. Alexander the Great, Julius Caesar, of course Napoleon Bonaparte, and we have here Genghis Khan, and we have here Ramesses. Okay, these are very famous names, of course, very powerful human beings, very powerful human beings. But if you look at any one of their lives, you will find very disturbed human beings. People who are very power hungry. People who almost had no emotions really to seeing human lives being taken. They were capable of immense cruelty to obtain their objectives. But that's what made them powerful and effective in building empires. Okay? Now you may say there are other names that were not as brutal, not as psychopathic, but those were the exceptions. Those are the exceptions. The vast majority of rulers who attain this level of power and prestige are typically people who are almost psychopathic, quite frankly, yeah? Because that's what it takes to be in that position to begin with. So this is something that we have to realize when we want to comment and exercise opinion concerning state affairs. If we look at rulers, monarchs, kings, leading figures in the modern world, we have to keep in mind that we're dealing with different types of people here, and the standard for those people is very different. It's not the standard we have as individuals. It's a very different standard. Islam recognizes that. Islam recognizes that. And we have to recognize that as well as individuals. People in power, if I had to give an analogy, they are like a beautiful flame, right? You have a beautiful flame, a beautiful fire going. From a distance, it's wonderful because it gives you light in the darkness. There's a benefit in having this because it gives you light in the darkness. It generates heat, or it can generate energy. So you can utilize that to boil water, to cook food, to keep yourself warm. And it's nice to look at, right? But the closer you get to this, the closer you get to this flame, the more you'll feel its heat. And if you are foolish enough to jump into it, it will consume you. This is power and people of power. From a distance, if you keep a safe distance, you can benefit from it because the heat, the light, the aesthetic. But if you concern yourself with getting closer and getting into it, you can burn yourself. This is the world of power and powerful people. So you have to keep a really a precautious distance from these issues because, again, the reality is very, very different to the ideal. Because in idyllic terms, there should be pious people, there should be kind people, there should be tolerant people, there should be patient people. But in reality, you only have to look at the first century of Islam, the Umayyads, the Abbasids, how they came to power, to realize very quickly that something is different here with this class of people. So they are like a flame that you need to have in the darkness. It's a necessity. And if you use it correctly, if you have a safe distance, if you handle it with care, you can benefit from it. But if you want to rush into it, you want to hold it, you want to extinguish it, you'll have problems. You'll have problems. Yeah. So as I say this, I don't want you to think, again, I keep saying this, I'm not trying to advocate for a specific position. I'm not trying to convince you to do anything, to believe anything. I just want you to know that these are things that, whether we like them or not, it's a reality. It's part of reality. Whether we acknowledge it or not, it's part of reality. And as I said, Islam acknowledges it. Islam acknowledges this reality. So in the Quran, for example, wonderful chapter, Bilqis says concerning Sayyidina Sulaiman, but also kings in general, people of power in general. The message reached her. She decided to consult her people, her consultants. Should we go to war? Should we not go to? What should we do in this situation here? And they gave her advice, let's go to war. Because she was a wise woman, she said, no, before we go to war, let's give him an offer. Let's give him a gift to see how he reacts. Then she says, out of experience, she says, الملوك إذا دخلوا قرية أفسدوها وجعلوا أعزة أهلها أذلة. That people of power, the muluk, the kings, anytime they enter a city, a certain territory, they destroy the place. They overturn the society. And they, you can almost say, they humble those who used to be in high position. And they effectively, that's how they subdue any opposition whatsoever. Okay? This is how they do things. It's just part of how they operate. She was herself a queen. She was in charge of an empire. And she's speaking, as a matter of fact, this is what they do. It's just the way they are. Okay? The Prophet ﷺ, according to Aisha radiallahu anha, our mother Aisha, she says, Al-Rasul ﷺ said to her, overlook the errors or the minor errors of the respected people. Overlook the minor errors of the respected people. Now, this respected people can be a vast category of people. It can be scholars. It can be elders. It can be people who have a lot of wealth and influence. But in the broadest term, it talks of people of power in society, whether good or bad. They are respected and they have power and they have also clout and authority. So if you think of a king or a president, who can be more influential and powerful in a country than that person, right? Rasul said, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and it's a sahih hadith. It's not one of those obscure hadith. It's sahih hadith. Al-Nisa'i, Abu Dawood, and also Al-Bukhari reported it. Sahih hadith. And he says, overlook their small mistakes of the respected people. Today we find the opposite. We go out of our way to find the smallest error, the smallest slip, the smallest mistake, so we can explode it on social media and we can make commentary on it. This is foolishness. This is foolishness. This is playing with fire. And Rasul said, no, do the opposite. Overlook. If you can overlook the small errors. Because the danger inherent in confronting power, most of us don't realize the danger inherent in confronting power. So if you can, overlook the small errors. And this is in Kitab Adab al-Mufrad. So again, for adab, there's a book for adab, and one of those things is to respect people in power and people who are respected. It doesn't mean that they have to be righteous. It just means they're respected in their society, in their circle, in wherever they are. They are people of authority and people who are respected. So the wise man understands that there is a balance here not to be disturbed. And if you can, overlook the small errors. Honestly, overlook the small errors. There's a lot of safety in that. Then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in the Quran instructs Sayyidina Musa and Harun to go to Fir'aun. And he tells them, go and give him the message and deliver to him my message to free the people, to stop being an oppressor. And then he says, subhanahu wa ta'ala, as an instruction, not a suggestion, as an instruction. فَقُولَا لَهُ قَوْلًا لَيِّنًا. It's not a suggestion. Maybe think about it. If you find him happy on that day, no, it's an instruction. It's an instruction. You have to do this. Allah says to do what? Speak to him gently. And this is Fir'aun, the man who said, he even shocked Shaitan. He said, أَنَا رَبُّكُمُ الْأَعْلَى. I am your Lord, the most elevated, the most high. That day Shaitan fled from him. It was too much. So that's the person Allah told Musa and Harun to speak to kindly, gently. فَقُولَ لَهُ قَوْلًا لَيِّنًا. This is etiquette for how to speak to people in power. And it's in the Quran. It's etiquette for how to speak to people in power. People who are respected. Whether they are good people or bad people, there is certain etiquette that has to be followed if you want to avoid greater harm. So in the Quran we find this. فَقُولَ لَهُ قَوْلًا لَيِّنًا لَعَلَّهُ يَتَذَكَّرُ أَوْ يَخْشَى. Because potentially if you do it that way, there is a potential he will be receptive to your message. There is a potential he'll be receptive to your message. And again, we find in the modern contemporary age, there are young Muslims, there can only be young Muslims really, who take the opposite approach. And they want to be harsh, and they want to be confrontational, and they want to be nitpicky, and they want to be deliberate in confronting people of power and authority. It's foolishness. This is not the way of the prophets. This is not the advice Allah told Musa and Harun to take when they went and confronted Fir'aun, who was known to be a taghut and a mujrim. But Allah says, nevertheless, when you speak to this man, do so with gentleness, because that's how you're going to reach him. If at all, that's the way to do it. So the reason why I'm doing this before we get into the Ibn Khaldun's Muqaddimah, I don't want you to think that this is unprincipled or that this is not Islamic. Or there is no Islamic basis for this. There is. There is. Yeah. So now let's get into Ibn Khaldun's Muqaddimah, and he wants to talk to us about business and about wealth and about happiness. So the chapter is about happiness, money, wealth. He is materialistic, I'll tell you that from the very beginning. He does believe that having money makes you happier, makes you better. He believes that. I'll make that very clear from the beginning. So they keep that in mind. However, he also wants to prove to us that there is a certain thing known as rank and status in society, and it is necessary that we have and maintain these things. So rank and status in society is by necessity something that we have to maintain and understand in society. It's not a utopia where every Muslim has the same right, the same status in society. It's not a realistic perspective of life. In fact, he argues the opposite, that Allah revealed and inspired human beings to live that way, to have different ranks and status. And he brings Quranic evidence for that. Okay? So he begins by telling us, ranks are useful in securing property. Ranks are useful in securing property. So for example, if you look at the social class in modern society, you have the working class, you have the upper class, the middle class, you have the elite, right? So you have different ranks in society. And Ibn Khaldun said that's a good thing to have. That's a good thing to have. And it's a useful thing to acquire property, to make money, okay? A person of rank has people approach him with their labor and property. And they do that in order to avoid harm and to obtain advantage, subhanallah. Allahu Akbar. And Ibn Khaldun's, first of all, we know he is a very senior jurist. We know that already. In fact, in Egypt, he was the highest ranking judge in Egypt. So he's talking to us not only from a sociological base, but also from a juristic base. So he says that to have rank is necessary, it's also useful, but what it does is it increases your property because people typically they tend to they're drawn to people of power and influence naturally. So he said because if you have power and rank and authority, people around you naturally come to you and they offer you labor and property. So they offer you free things. They offer you free things. And they do that so they can avoid harm and to obtain advantage. This sentence here, to avoid harm and to obtain advantage, is one of the principles of jurisprudence in Islam. In everything and anything, the first priority is to avoid harm, number one, and then to bring benefit. The first priority should always be to avoid or to minimize harm or to mitigate harm before drawing benefit. So, for example, let's say you live in a neighborhood, you're the only Muslim in the neighborhood, right? Nobody else is Muslim in the neighborhood. And suddenly there's a terrorist attack somewhere in your country. And now people are looking for somebody to blame and they're thinking of Muslims. You're the only Muslim in that neighborhood. You have two options. One option is to seek to make da'wah in a gentle way, in an intelligent way, to inform people about the true Islam and to kind of answer questions they may have. Or the opposite is to confront them, to be confrontative, to show them that you're not afraid of them and that you stand for Islam and you're going to defend yourself. These are two options you have. One option draws harm to you because you are being confrontational in a situation where you are outnumbered. You're bringing harm to yourself. The other one is to bring benefits. So the wise thing to do is to minimize the harm. So you may not convert them to Islam. That's okay. They don't have to be Muslim. But what can you do to help them understand Islam in a way that they're not afraid of Islam and they don't feel that you are the enemy? So in that situation, you first work on minimizing the harm. That's the most important thing. You minimize the harm before you try to gain advantage. Yeah. I'm going to give a very crude example here, but I want you to be patient with me. If you are in a position where there are 100,000 Muslims whose lives are in danger, and you are in a position of power, but you want to attain a specific objective that may require for 100,000 Muslims to die for you to attain that objective, Islamically, if we're talking about Islamically, the priority is to reduce the harm first and foremost. That is to make sure that you don't lose these 100,000 Muslims. The priority is what? To minimize the harm before attaining the benefit. So by principle, you should be working on how do I minimize the harm possible to this community? Even if I lose the benefit, let me minimize the harm. That's the Islamic principle. It is not, let me maximize benefit even if I get harm. Let me go for the goal even if the 100,000 die. Yeah. That's not the Islamic principle. Islamic principle, minimize the harm, even if the benefit is lost, minimize the harm. So he says, these people here, when you have a rank, they come to you because they want you to help them, but also they want to be safe from you, effectively. They want to be safe from the harm that you can bring to them. And if it's possible, they want to benefit from your status. Okay? So this already sounds a bit almost like a sycophantic approach to life. You only make friends or you only treat people well if you want to be safe from their harm or if you want them to benefit you. It doesn't sound very principled. Okay? It doesn't sound very principled, quite frankly, but it's the reality of things. Then he mentions ranks are widely distributed amongst people. And there are various levels of rank among them. So as I mentioned before, we have various ranks. Many of us are either working class, middle class, upper middle class, elite. This is something that in most societies you will find different ranks, and most people fit in the lower ranks, right? At the very top, he says, they extend to the rulers, above whom there is nobody. So the rulers of a country, of a nation, of a state, of a jurisdiction, they are the highest placed people in that society and at the highest rank. At the very top are these people. And at the very bottom, he says, they extend to those who have nothing to gain or lose. So at the very top of the hierarchy, totem pole, he says there are the rulers. And at the very bottom of the hierarchy, there are those who have nothing to gain or lose. Very interesting. When you're at the position where you have nothing to gain or lose in a situation, it's very easy for you to say, well, the guy on top should do this, because you don't have nothing to lose or gain. So it's very easy for you at the bottom to make demands that the guy on top has to think about 1,000 times before making the move. I'll give you another crude example. Syria. Many of us are very eloquent critics of Ahmed Shara. He should do this, he should do that, he should go into this war, he should go into that. It's easy for us to do it because we're at the bottom of the totem pole. We have neither anything to gain or lose if something goes wrong. But the guy on the very top of the hierarchy, it's a different situation for him. So he's mentioning that at the very top, there are the rulers who are at the very top of the hierarchy. And at the very bottom, he says, there are those who have nothing to gain or lose. And in between these two extremities, there are many classes. There are various levels in between these two extremities. Then he concludes by saying, this is God's wise plan with regard to his creation. In other words, this is as Allah had intended it to be. This is as Allah had intended to be, that we should not always be on the same level socially, that there should be different levels, different ranks. Okay, this is where some of us, again, our Western conditioning has fooled us, has tricked us into thinking that a perfect society is a perfectly egalitarian society. In other words, the perfect Muslim society is one there is no rank and there is no status. We're all the same. That's not reality. That's not how it was supposed to be. And he goes a step further by saying, in fact, Allah wants it to be the way it is today, which is different ranks and different statuses. So Ibn Khaldun is already telling us that as far as he's concerned,
for the rest of that.
As far as he's concerned, a society that has no class structure is an unnatural society. There should be class structure and there should be ranks. That's how he sees it. We'll understand why. So here he gives us, we have an example in the Quran. At the very end of Surah Al-An'am, Allah says, and he has raised some of you above others in degrees so that he could try you through what he has given you. So in other words, Allah has made some people higher ranking on earth. It's the way it is. Some people are powerful. They have authority. They have wealth. That's how they are. Allah says, and other people have lower rank. Okay, they're not influential. They're not powerful. They don't have money. But Allah says, I have done that. I have done that so that I can test you to see what you will do with what you have. So if you have a lot of authority, a lot of power, okay, you'll be tested that way. And if you have none of that or very little of that, you're also being tested. Are you going to be patient? Are you going to be obedient to those who do have power? How do you react to somebody who has something different to what you have? So Allah mentions this in Surah Al-An'am, that this is how He created the world, and that human beings will have different degrees and different ranks. Okay, this is how He, subhanahu wa ta'ala, has created this world and has desired it to be. So we have to understand that is a reality of life, and there are hierarchies and there is social structure. Oftentimes we misread history or we misread seerah. So for example, we will say, yes, but in Medina, Al-Rasul sallallahu alayhi wasallam, he took the Ansar and the Muhajirin and he made them brothers. And that's correct. Indeed, they were brothers. And in Islam, we're all equal. Not one is better than the other. As we know, the final sermon, the black is not better than the white not better than the black, the Arab and the non-Arab, except with taqwa. That's all true. But it does not negate the fact that there was social structure in Medina. It doesn't negate that. Don't imagine in your brain that somehow this was a perfect society with no class structure and everyone had the same thing and were equal in everything. No. There was indeed class structure, and it had to be that way. We have a very famous incident when Rasulullah himself, sallallahu alayhi wasallam, he instructed the Ansar to stand up for one of their leaders, to stand up. And it's one of the few instances in the entire seerah where Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wasallam does that. So we know the famous incidents of following the Battle of Khandaq. Yeah, we know what happened, and some of the Jewish tribes betrayed, Banu Qurayza betrayed. And so there was a meeting to decide what to do next. How should we extract revenge, or should we forgive? What should we do next? Sa'ad, who was a leader, he was a leader amongst the Ansar, came. He was injured. He came. And so when he was drawing close to the assembly, Rasulullah instructed sallallahu alaihi wasallam to the people. They said, stand up for your leader. Stand up for your leader as a sign of respect and honor. Yeah. Now, I know very well that many of us will never stand up for an imam if we was into a room. If we were told to stand up for him, we would say, this is bid'ah. What is this? We don't do this for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. This is not, we don't worship human beings. It's not about worshiping human beings. It's about recognizing rank and status, even amongst the best human beings that lived on the earth. They recognize the rank and status. And the Prophet ﷺ in this instance is enforcing it. And he's telling them, stand up, and he says, for your leader. Now the question is this. In Medina, who was the leader of Medina? If you think about it, why is Rasulullah saying for your leader? Is he not the leader? Of course he's the leader. Of course he's the leader of the Ansar and the Muhajirin. Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam. But in this instance, he's emphasizing that even amongst the Ansar, there is a social structure that has to be respected. So when that tribe, their leader came, Rasul said, Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam, stand up for your leader. He recognized him as a leader. He recognized him as a leader. This is why, for example, I often say, if you're in the group, I will say the Saudis have their own kings. That's their king. Khalas, he's not a king for the whole Muslim Ummah, but for the Saudis, that's their leader. And they should respect their leader. Right? And if they're happy with him, who are we outside to dictate to them what they should do in their own country? He's their leader. Likewise, in Pakistan, they have their leader. Right? Whatever, they have their leader. Well, it doesn't have to be perfect, but you have to recognize that there is a social ranking in every society. Yeah, and you have to recognize that. So Rasulullah recognized that. So he told his people, stand up for your leader. Okay, a very powerful statement here. So let's keep going. So Ibn Khaldun is telling us he believes in this, and it's in fact part of Allah's will on earth that we should have these sort of levels. Okay, we should have this structure. There's nothing wrong with it. If we think something is wrong with it, is it because I believe, personally, it's my opinion, it can be wrong. I believe it's because of the Western conditioning that many of us have actually taken on, subconsciously not realizing. The principles, and it's not really principles that are upheld, but at least it's written, that we are all free, we are all equal, and we are all effectively on the same status, right? That we are all equal in that sense. No, there is status, and there is pedigree, and there is rank. Even in marriage, even in business dealings, there is. If you look at the books of the fuqaha, there are principles of kufur, for example, kafala. So there are principles of equality in rank. It's recognized in Islam. So when we think that the average Muslim has the right, or has the duty, in fact, not just the right, the duty. It's my duty to correct the ruler, or to correct the imam here, to correct the amir, or to correct the governor. It's a misunderstanding of history and a misunderstanding of Islamic history. Yeah, because there was always social ranking and status. We respect and recognize that. It's only in the Western Hemisphere, to a certain degree, where they don't respect and recognize that. And it's possible for the average person on the road to confront a very senior ranking politician on television and to insult him or to insult her or to mock them, right? And we've seen this. If you live in the West, you know this is possible, right? You'll mock the president or the queen, or you'll be very, very insulting of them if you see them in public. That's the ideal that they live towards. We want to be in a position where there is no rank and status, and we get to, anyone can say anything to anyone. Not in Islam. That's not how we operate in the Islamic world. There is rank and status. A couple of weeks ago, I saw a very funny video of, I don't know his name. Some of the brothers here can, maybe sisters can tell me. The young prince in Morocco. I don't know his name. The young prince in Morocco is a young man.
I think it's
You know,
Hassan.
okay, that's his name. Barakallahu fikum. And there's an entire reel, a video reel of men trying to kiss his hands, and he pulls it away. Has anyone seen that video yet? It's online. It's on social media, various sites, where there's a compilation of dignitaries and very highly ranking people. When they meet him, they want to kiss his hand, and he pulls his hand away. And he does it all the time. He pulls his hand away, right? But they're showing him submissiveness, and they're recognizing his rank, although he's a young man. Okay? So these are things that look strange in the Western world, but it's not strange in other parts of the world. That is still part of the society, and we need it, quite frankly. So it has been established that a single human being could not fully exist by himself. Again, this goes against the grain when you look at the Western hemisphere, the Western perspective, that you are individual and you are free and you are not in need of other people. And you get to choose what to do, how to do it, how to express yourself. You are self-sufficient, effectively. Ibn Khaldun says no. In a real society, in the real world, no single human being can suffice for themselves. You need to have other people around you. You need to cooperate. You need to cooperate. But he goes a step further. He says, such cooperation is obtained by the use of force. So in other words, human beings should not be left to their own device to decide for themselves to cooperate. They have to be forced to do it. There has to be a structure, a system, a mechanism that would force people to cooperate, even if they have to use force. Yeah? So the reason being, people are largely ignorant of the interest of the human species. Allahu Akbar. The Quran says this, if you follow the majority of people, what will happen? Allah says in the Quran, if you follow the majority of people, what will happen? You'll be misguided. You'll be misguided. And in the previous session here, we discussed Ibn Khaldun's opening line when he says, most people cannot even manage their own affairs. Most human beings can't even manage their own affairs. They need to have somebody above them to manage their affairs for them. So here he says, if the individuals were left to decide for themselves how to work together, how to cooperate, it would never happen. Because even that one individual cannot work for himself, cannot be self-sufficient fully. So cooperation is completely necessary. However, human beings, because they are not always wise, will need someone who will enforce upon them how to cooperate. Yeah? How to cooperate. And these are statements that we're all under that umbrella. Okay? We're all under the umbrella. This is why popular revolutions don't work. Popular revolutions don't work because it's based on popular or populist sentiments. It's not based upon a group of qualified, experienced, people have expertise in a certain field. It's generally based on the public opinion of something or the public sentiment, even worse, the sentiment. So revolutions based on that typically fail, especially in the Muslim world. Because, as he says, most people are largely ignorant of the interest of the human species. They don't know what's good for the wider perspective. They may know what's good for them, but they won't know what's good for the broader perspective. So there has to be someone above them or something above them that will force them to behave. Yeah? And these are things that are very strange to hear because we live in Western liberal societies. We don't like to be told what to do. Right? We don't like to be told what to do. So to be told here that actually you need to be, in fact, forced sometimes to do the right thing because by yourself, you can't achieve what is optimal for society. It's a bit of a shock. So therefore, he says it is obligatory to make them cooperate. To make them cooperate. To make them cooperate. It's wajib to do that. This is what is meant by the verse. So he mentions the verse of the Quran. It's not really a good translation here, so I've taken the actual Arabic and a better translation. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, it is we who have apportioned among them their livelihoods in this life, and we have raised some of them above others in degree, in darajat, that they may make use of one another for service. So Allah says very clearly here that livelihood, sustenance, Allah has already apportioned it. We all have a portion of what we will earn in this life. But at the same time, we need to make actions, we need to cooperate. So Allah says, then we have raised some above others. Some will be bosses, others will be employees. Some will be masters, others will be slaves. Some will be wealthy, others will be less wealthy. This is the way it was designed. It's part of life. Yeah? So Ibn Khaldun citing the ayah to support what he said to us just now. Okay? It's just the way it is. So we should not be imagining a society where there is no class structure, where we all have the same amount of money, there's no leader, there's no somebody above you. No, this is the way life is supposed to be. In the perfect Muslim society, this will still be there because it's part of the human experience. Yeah. So when he says, actually, it's quite interesting. When he says it is obligatory, somebody has their mic on. Can you please mute the mics? When he says it is obligatory to make people cooperate, it sounds a bit like dictatorship, doesn't it? Fascism. Is this what we're supposed to live under? Dictatorship? No, it doesn't mean that. The best example, the best analogy I could find was of Ali Shariati, Dr. Ali Shariati. He's one of the founding fathers, or you could say one of the masterminds behind the Iranian Revolution of '79. Ali Shariati. He died before '79, but he was one of the founding fathers. He gives an analogy. He says that in a society, the government is supposed to be the parents or the guardian. And a guardian or a parent is supposed to raise children in the best possible way to prepare them for life later on. So he says in liberal society, like in the West, because he studied in France, he studied in Paris, so he was in a liberal environment. He critiques that. He says in a liberal society, where the government only governs certain aspects, for example, finance, law, certain aspects, and leaves the rest to the person to decide for themselves. For example, matters to do with morality and ethics, how to live your life. The government says we're not involved in that. He compares that to taking a child to the park and to giving them ice cream. Of course, a child enjoys that, but you don't raise a child in the park and you don't feed them ice cream all day, even if they say to you that's what we're happy with. That's bad parenting. Whereas a nation where there is stricter law and they regulate conduct, not only the financial aspect, but also the moral and ethical aspects, he compares that to sending a child to school. And in school, the child has to go a certain time, has to do work, has to read. It's not enjoyable for most children, but that is the best way to raise the child to be self-dependent, to be educated, to have adab, and to survive in the long term. So a government that's permissive, that allows people to do what they like, is like a parent who just gives the child ice cream, and whatever the child cries for, hey, you can have it. In the short term, it helps the child, it helps you, but in the long term, you destroy the society. Contrarily to that, if you send a child to school, it may be difficult, but you know that in the long term, you're benefiting that child beyond measure. Yeah? So this is why sometimes it's compulsory, as Ibn Khaldun says, that the governing body should force the people to comply. Sometimes it's necessary to do that. Because if you give them what they want, in the long term, you're destroying society. And again, I think the recent news in America is a good case study for that. Over the last 8 years, we've been under the DEI program, diversity, inclusion, and equality, and these kind of programs where we want everyone to be equal. There's no classism here. We should all be equal. Okay, what has that produced for us? What has that produced for America in the last 8 years? Some benefits comes about, of course, because Muslims get certain benefits, women, minorities, but in the grand scheme, it causes some great problems. Because we have witnessed in that 8 years, children being indoctrinated, sexual programming at a very young age, and it was being forced even in school, right? So if you have a system whereby there is no check and balance, and you get to do what you like, you end up with a long-term problem. You destroy the society in the long term. Even though the short term may be beneficial, in the long term, you destroy. Sometimes you have to have strict laws that you enforce upon people for the greater benefit. Yeah. So that is an interesting take from Ibn Khaldun. So then he goes on to say, it has thus become clear that rank means the power enabling human beings to be active amongst fellow men under their control, with permission and prohibition, and to have forceful superiority over them. Because again, this is very strong language, right? To have forceful superiority over them in order to make them avoid things harmful to them. Allahu Akbar. Allahu Akbar. Yeah. So you can see the theme already. It's saying, look, it may not be nice, it may not be sweet, but it's a medicine that has to be forced sometimes. If you leave the people to decide for themselves, they will make the wrong decisions. So sometimes you have to enforce this, even though it may not be nice in the short term. You have to enforce it. Let me ask you a question as a group. Let me give an example. In fact, not a question, give an example. Following, I mentioned Ali Shariati and the Iran Revolution in 79. The Iranian people at the time wanted freedom. They didn't want to have the Shah of Iran. He was very, very tyrannical. He was very tyrannical, but at the same time, he was very progressive. So they went out, demonstrated, until eventually they got what they wanted. The Shah was taken out, and they had a revolution. It wasn't long after that everything turned around. Okay, everything turned around, and the Americans who got rid of him were the same people saying he wasn't hard enough. Subhanallah, he wasn't harsh enough. Reagan came on camera, on television, and he said Carter made an error. He should have supported the Shah. He wasn't harsh enough, because what we thought was harsh at the time, now we see it, according to the Western perspective, wasn't harsh enough. They needed a person like that in position of power, because when they removed him, look what they got. They got Khomeini. Likewise, you may look and say Saddam is harsh, Gaddafi is harsh, but in 2025, there are some people who would say, bring them back, please. It was harsh, but it was better than what we have today. Yeah? We need people who can enforce certain laws. Even if there are some negative aspects, at the very least, we have the general safety and stability of society. So sometimes you have to have people who can force certain things, even if you don't like the medicine being given, it is still medicine. Yeah? So this is what he's saying here, that sometimes you have to force people, because most of the people, they don't know what's good for them. They don't know what's good for them. Okay? So now he mentions the acts of justice and religion and politics. This word becomes very, very, very important to pay attention, because justice can be interpreted in different ways. Okay? Religion and politics is very powerful, and those in power in these sorts of positions, they can misuse the power very easily. Somebody who has a lot of religious authority can very easily misuse that authority. Somebody who's very powerful in politics can also misuse it. Right? So he mentions that very, very clearly. Then he says, much good can fully exist only in conjunction with the existence of some little evil, which is the result of the matter. So you have to realize that there are no perfect rulers. Don't expect your ruler to be perfect. You know, if he stutters, that doesn't make him a bad ruler. If he stutters, it doesn't make him a bad ruler, because it's still possible that there's a lot of good, even though there may be a little bit of bad. Right? So he says, keep that in mind. It's still possible that there is good that exists, even though there is some evil as well. Okay? He says the good does not disappear because there's evil involved. This is powerful stuff. The good does not disappear because there is some evil involved, but it attaches itself to little evil that gathers around it. So in other words, yes, there may be some corruption, there may be some tyranny, but the good that overrides that ultimately is what you should be focusing on, not the small errors or the small evil, because that's essentially inevitable. This is why in the hadith we have a very famous instruction that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will defend the ummah even with an evil person. Allah will defend the community, the ummah, even behind an evil person. And so he says, this is the meaning of the occurrence of injustice in the world. It should be understood. People need to know this. People need to know this. Because if you don't realize that very basic principle in life, and you focus only on the negative things, you will never be satisfied with anyone. You'll always be in a position of being unhappy, rebelling, and causing civil unrest. I have to realize there is a lot of good that can be still present, but it will not be free of evil. There will always be a little bit of evil here and there, but you have to realize that that's the reality of life. Yeah? You don't have a perfect ruler. So you have to be willing to be patient and to acknowledge the good outweighs the bad. Think of any ruler you like in the last 500 years, even the last 1,000 years. The best rulers you can think of. It's very difficult to think of a ruler that is great that doesn't have some sort of blemish, some sort of mistake, some sort of excess in their personality and character. Of course, we exclude the prophets because they are divinely ordained. They don't make mistakes. It's part of our aqidah. Ma'asum, so we don't even go there. But the human being in general, great rulers make great mistakes. It's just the way it is. Right? There are many names that we oftentimes cite as being great rulers. If only we could have this sultan back, or this khalifa back, or this imam back. But if you look at the detail, they made some errors. Terrible errors. Sometimes massacred and genocided people. Right? It's in the fine detail. But we look at the greater good. We don't look at everything. Because if we did that, we would be left with no one left, really, pretty much. Only a few people left. So you have to realize that, yes, sometimes you might have a king that rules over you. You don't like the way he talks. Okay, khair, can you live with that? Because you may not like the way he talks, but you're not living in a society that's being turned upside down with war. You have stability. You have safety. You can travel freely. لا أقسم بهذا البلد وأنت حل بهذا البلد وأنت حل بهذا البلد. Yeah, that's a very powerful statement. That to be free in a society is a huge thing. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says you are free in this society. That was in Mecca. Yeah. So if they can guarantee you freedom of movement in your land, you can practice your deen openly. Don't be so quick to judge minor things here and there and to cause problems. Because you will never find a ruler that is free of all blemish. There will always be some evil. Always some evil. So he's a realist. So consequently, he says, a person who seeks and desires rank must be obsequious and use flattery as powerful men and rulers require. So this is where we begin to disagree with Ibn Khaldun completely. We have to disagree with him. Say, listen, we agreed with you so far. We can understand what he's saying. You're realistic when it comes to politics and society. We can understand that. But this is where we draw the line. Because Ibn Khaldun now tries to convince us that for you to be powerful or to gain proximity to power, you have to use flattery and deceit. Because that's what powerful men and rulers require, and it's true. Powerful people want to always be praised. They want you to praise them, to stroke the ego. Ibn Khaldun says that is a legitimate way to attain their favor, to use flattery, right? To use deceit. And we say to him, no, thank you. We don't praise people insincerely. We don't do that because Islamically it's not allowed. Yeah? But he's describing what was happening at the time. So otherwise, he says, it is impossible for you to attain any rank. In other words, if you don't do this, you're not going to get any rank. Right? You're not going to advance in life. You're not going to be promoted at work. You have to suck up to the boss or to the executive. Otherwise, you're not going to go anywhere in life. Okay? And of course, he was a bureaucrat. This is what he did for a living. So we understand where he's coming from, but we have to say to him, thank you, but no thank you. That's a step too far for us. Okay? We're not going to use flattery and deceit to gain power. And we can make it without doing that, by the way. Okay, so again, personally, I disagree with him on this point. It is possible to be a great human being, to attain greatness without compromising your integrity and principles. Okay? Therefore, we have stated that obsequiousness and flattery are the reasons why a person may be able to obtain rank that produces happiness and profit, and that most wealthy and happy people have the quality of this to use flattery. So according to his observation, experience, to be happy in life and to be wealthy in life and to be influential in life, you have to be somebody who uses flattery and deceit. You need to suck up to the people in power. You need to, I will use this term because it's in currency now, boot licking. This is where that comes into position. Brown nosing, sucking up. Right? Ibn Khaldun is saying, yes, you need to do a bit of that to obtain power, wealth, and influence, and ultimately happiness. Okay? Again, we disagree with him. He's not principled. Thus, too, he says. Now, this is where he goes the other way. He goes the other way. So not only is he telling us we have to be people who flatter, but he goes the other way to say, if you don't do that, you are going to be poor and you're going to be wretched for the rest of your life. So he says, thus, many people who are proud and supercilious have no use for rank. So he's attaching pride with dignity. He's saying, if you don't do what I'm doing, what I'm telling you to do, it's because you're proud. You have kibr. You think you're superior. Okay, you think you are too good. So he says, their earnings are restricted. They become poor. And they have to work with their own hands to make a living. And they are reduced to poverty and indigence. So Ibn Khaldun is telling you, if you don't get involved in the office politics, if you don't get involved with the after-work social gatherings, if you don't laugh at the jokes in the office, you will be overlooked, you'll be impoverished, and you'll be a nobody in life. Right? This is quite interesting, coming from Ibn Khaldun, quite frankly, and it's quite disappointing. It's quite disappointing, right? Because this is not what Islam has taught us to be like or to do. But it's passing it on to us as a fact of life. If you don't do these things, you will not advance in life and you'll become somebody who's poor, who will die, and who will be completely deprived. And you are only doing that because you are proud. So he goes on to double down even further. It should be known that such haughtiness and pride are blameworthy qualities, subhanAllah. So a man who decides not to speak, to sweet talk, to deceive, to flatter people of power and influence, Ibn Khaldun calls that person haughty and pride, and that it is a bad quality to have. And he says because these people, they think that they are perfect, and they are above doing that with other people. And so what do they earn from that? He says, for instance, a scholar who is deeply versed in his science, a very knowledgeable scholar, or a scribe, an author, a litterateur, a person, an academic, or a poet who makes good poetry. He says these people are typically the type of people who don't want to flatter and praise rulers. And he considers those people proud and arrogant and haughty, and they will die impoverished and nobodies. Right? Now the question is, where is this coming from? Where is this coming from? Where is this coming from, Ibn Khaldun? It's coming from two places. Ironically, in the same book, the Muqaddimah, Ibn Khaldun writes, under the chapter of teaching and learning, he writes that it is blameworthy to praise people for money. He literally writes that in the same book. He says it is blameworthy to praise people for money. And then in this chapter, it's telling us you have to do it. Otherwise, you'll be too proud and too arrogant and you'll die poor. But the reason why, it's my personal theory, why he mentions this, especially about scholars, is because Ibn Khaldun himself numerous times in his life has met rulers who were tyrannical or who had bad intentions, and to save his own life, he had to praise them. He had to praise them, or he had to sweet talk them. And so I believe it's because he, what he lacks in himself, he doesn't consider it possible for anybody else effectively, because he couldn't stand and be firm and consistent in those situations. He considers anyone else who does that to be too haughty, too proud. Okay, but he himself didn't live up to the ideal, because when he meets, for example, Timur, and we will explore that inshallah, he meets Timur, and he begins to praise him, unbelievable praise, unbelievable praise, and he begins to praise the Turks as the greatest human beings, and he's the king of the world. Crazy stuff. But it was because he was afraid for his life. Afraid for his life. So this is what he mentions about people who don't want to praise, who don't want to brown nose, that they are arrogant people. And he targets specifically scholars. Specifically scholars. Yeah. So an example of this, by the way, quite interestingly, is Sheikh Nasiruddin al-Albani, rahimahullah. When he was in Saudi Arabia, and I spoke to one of a very prominent student of his in the UK, very prominent student. We were discussing once. He's obviously a senior person. He's a lot older than I am. And during one of these, you could say, Arab Spring events, we just discussed privately. I said to him, listen, I don't like these rulers. I don't really like what they're doing in their countries, but I understand that for the greater good, it may not be such a good idea to overthrow them, right? At the moment, we don't need to have more destabilized nations in the Muslim world. Although I agree, they're not really the best people in power. So he began to tell me a few things, and he mentioned Sheikh Nasiruddin al-Albani as well. Okay? One of the reasons why he was banished from Saudi Arabia more than once is because while he was in Saudi Arabia, and he told me this as a student, he told me this, Sheikh Nasiruddin did not like to sweet talk very influential people in Saudi society. When they would walk into a room, there would people kiss their hands as a sign of respect. He refused to do that, for example. Or he would refuse to honor them in certain ways that people thought was necessary. So again, to kind of bend the knee. So because he was unrelenting and he did what Ibn Khaldun said you shouldn't be doing, he was considered haughty, right, and proud, and he faced difficulties. So he was kicked out of Saudi twice, by the way. This in his biography is undisputed, because he was somebody who was not willing to speak in a certain way in Saudi Arabia. He wasn't willing to do that. He was very outspoken, very outspoken, very, very outspoken. In fact, when he was in Saudi, he wrote a very famous book on the attire of Muslim women. A very famous book, Libas al-Mar'at al-Muslima, and the woman's attire, the Muslim woman's attire, in which he brought all the authentic ahadith and narrations to prove it was not fard for a woman to wear niqab. Imagine that, going to Saudi Arabia, in a society where this was the norm, and writing a book to refute the idea that it is fard to cover your face. He wrote the book, and he published it. So he went against the current, against the grain. And for that reason, many people in the society didn't want him there. He was not conforming to what was established at the time, which was you respect people of power, authority. And as Ibn Khaldun would be a great Saudi scholar, a great Saudi politician, a great Saudi governor, because he is willing to do what it takes to rise above the ranks, to flatter, to turn the other cheek, to use deception, to attain power, influence, and prosperity. But there were many scholars who didn't take that position, and they suffered as a result of that. But we know who they are. They didn't die nobodies. We know who they are. We remember them, and they have a very high status amongst the Muslims. So Ibn Khaldun is perfectly wrong in that assessment. Yeah. However, in essence, he is not wrong altogether, because there are certain levels of compromise that are necessary at times for mere survival, just to survive. Just to survive. So I think he's talking to himself when he mentions having to make use of flattery, because he does it several times. But at the same time, we have to acknowledge that certain situations require a bit of compromise. Okay, certain situations require a bit of compromise. Ibn Khaldun then goes to meet Timur. Timur, of course, wanted to conquer, and he went into Damascus. So some of the Mamluk sultans went, an army went towards Damascus to confront him, because Ibn Khaldun was a judge in Egypt. He also accompanied the army. So he was going to Damascus to confront Timur and his army. And it so happened that Timur, of course, he didn't have to fight because they knew he was there. He basically, Timur is Timur, right? You don't go against him. But when the army decided to go home to Egypt, Ibn Khaldun stayed, because it was said that Timur wants to see you. Timur wants to see you, and he mentioned him by name. Ibn Khaldun, when he heard that, he was frightened for his life. Okay? What does Timur, first of all, how does he know who I am? Secondly, why does he want to meet me in specific, in particular? So Ibn Khaldun now is very frightened for his life, and he's going to tell us a bit more about the encounter, and then we're going to get to read what he said to Timur. Yeah? We're going to read what he said to Timur. Effectively, he's putting his skills and his theories to practice. Okay, so Ibn Khaldun, he goes to Damascus, and the army effectively turns back and goes back to Egypt, but he remains in Damascus. So the Qadi Burhan ad-Din informed him that Timur had specifically requested Ibn Khaldun in his presence. Okay, so he was specifically called to come to the presence of Timur. There's an image here of that encounter. This is supposedly Timur, and this is Ibn Khaldun. Yeah? He was specifically called to meet Timur. So Ibn Khaldun says, we spent that night making preparations to go to Timur the next day. This is praying at night, pleading to God to forgive and to help him, because this is a very tremendous and frightening encounter. So he spent the whole night preparing, okay, for the worst, effectively. I heard about this late at night, and I feared some attempt on my own life. So, of course, clearly he's worried that if the emperor wants to meet me in person, it may be because he wants to execute me, to kill me, or to punish me. Therefore, I arose at dawn and went to the group of judges who were at the city gate. Okay, so now he is going to go in, effectively face his fate. He considered running away, but it was futile. He considered the options of running away and considered it to be actually a greater harm. So he thought, let me just go and see what happens. So he goes to the city gates, and he says, near the city gates, I found some of Timur's retinue. Some of the soldiers were there. I said to them, may Allah prolong your lives. And they responded, may Allah prolong your life. And I said, may I be your ransom? And they said, may we be your... So in other words, he's beginning to show signs of compromise, and he wants to make them know that he's not a problem to them. He wants to make it very known, I'm not here to confront or to challenge you at all. Okay? So when I stood at the entrance of the Sultan's tent, so now he reaches right outside the tent of Timur, and he's waiting for permission. He says, I was given permission to be seated in a tent adjoining his own. So he was told to wait at reception, effectively. And you could imagine what's going through his mind at this stage. Okay, what does Timur have to say to me? Will I walk out of here with my head intact? What exactly is happening in the tent next door? And effectively, what will it take for me to walk out of here with my life? Okay, so he's completely frightened, and he says, I'm waiting there until eventually his name is announced. He says, my name was announced, and they use a title, the Maliki Qadi of the Maghrib. So this is the high judge in the Maliki school in al-Maghrib. At the time was, of course, North Africa. So he says, they call me by a title, a grand title, the Maliki Qadi of North Africa. Yeah, was added to it. So I was summoned, and when I entered the tent to approach him, he was reclining on his elbow while platters of food were being passed before him, and which he ordered to be sent to various groups. So effectively, Timur was enjoying himself at the time when Ibn Khaldun was called. Okay, so it's not something that effectively would have been as he anticipated. He probably thought there would be a court, an executioner, a judge, and he would come and have to defend himself. But he enters and he finds himself in a place where people are enjoying themselves, they're eating, and Timur is reclining. Okay, so reclining. Timur was resting, effectively eating, he was enjoying himself. And upon entering, Ibn Khaldun says, I spoke first. So before waiting for Timur to address him, he broke the ice and he said, Assalamu alaikum. And I made a gesture of humility. Okay? So he wants to make very clear from the very beginning, I am submitting. I'm not coming to confront you. I'm coming in peace, and I want you to know very clearly. I'm making gestures because Timur didn't speak Arabic. So Assalamu alaikum is universal. We all know what that means. And he said, I made a gesture of humility, either bowing or lowering his head, to make it very known that I am coming submissively. Okay? I'm not causing problems for you. Thereupon he raised his head, so Timur noticed him, and stretched out his hand to me. Ibn Khaldun says, I kissed his hand. So if there's any doubt whatsoever left, this has been removed. He said, I kissed his hand, and he made a sign to me to sit down. I did so just where I had been standing. In other words, as soon as he said sit down, I sat down where I was. Yeah. So he's very submissive. He's very submissive. Why is this? Because he understands, first of all, he knows what Timur is. He knows. The reputation of this man precedes him. So he knows already who Timur is. And in fact, around that time, several years prior, Ibn Khaldun had heard of a prophecy, some sort of prophecy that was floating around. People who used to study the constellations, the stars, were foretelling of a bloodthirsty but very powerful conqueror who would come and conquer the lands. He was from the Turks. So he had heard this from various people, from Jewish people, from Muslim people, in Al-Andalus, in Maghreb. He had heard this already. So he had suspicions that this could be the man. Okay, he had suspicions this could be the man. So he made it very clear that I'm not coming to confront you. I'm coming to. I'm submissive. He kissed his hand. He sat down, and Timur had other plans in mind. So he began to question Ibn Khaldun. First of all, he knew Ibn Khaldun was. Timur was very well read. He was very, very intelligent, and he was very, very sharp. So he knew Ibn Khaldun, and he knew Ibn Khaldun came of the army, which is why he called for him specifically. Which shocked Ibn Khaldun because when they called him by his title, the Grand Judge of the Malik school. And so he knew who he was talking to effectively. So Timur begins to quiz Ibn Khaldun. Okay. By the way, this entire encounter, Ibn Khaldun writes it down. Kitab al-Ibar. It's in there. It's a very concise translation. I don't want to bore you with all the details. It's very lengthy, by the way. It's a lengthy read. So I've just taken the key aspects of it and put it here for concise to recount what happened concisely. So Timur asks him, he begins to question him. Where are you from? Where were you born? He says, I'm born from the Maghreb, so on and so forth. I said, where exactly? Okay. He begins to quiz him. So he then questioned him about his position. How did you become such a high-ranking position, high-ranking person in your government? And he was paying attention to the answers. Okay. Then he's questioning him about his origins. How's Fez, for example? Ibn Khaldun gave, you could say, diplomatic answers, very general answers, to which Timur says, I'm not happy with this. These answers do not satisfy me. I want you to give me specific details. In fact, you need to write an entire description of the entire region of Maghreb, including the distant and the near parts, the mountains and the rivers, the villages and the cities, in a detailed manner, such that I can almost visualize it. So he says to him, I want you to be specific, and I want you to write everything you know about the region you came from in such detail that it is almost if I can see it. Okay? And then he signaled for food to be brought so Ibn Khaldun can eat. So he says, I took the food, I drank the drink, and this impressed Timur. Okay? So this is a sign of saying, I trust you. He's showing Timur that I trust you. Okay? So Ibn Khaldun was then given time. He went away. He did indeed write everything he knew. about the Maghreb. This is Timur's way of scoping out where to go next. So it was actually quite dangerous to support him and help him that way, but he had to do it. So he says he did that and he fulfilled the assignment. Then he says, I sat down in remained silent. I was overcome with fear. He was completely still, afraid for his own life, and he remained silent. He sat down and remained silent. Then he said, but because I was so afraid, I began to think in my mind, what can I say to make him less likely to turn on me? So he says, I composed in my mind some words to say to Timur, by exalting him and his governments to flatter him. So this is why it makes sense now. Ibn Khaldun tells us in the Muqaddimah earlier on that to use flattery is actually a good thing. And only somebody who is arrogant would not use flattery because he had to do so. So he says, but before this, when I was in the Maghreb, I had heard many predictions concerning his appearance. This is a man, like I said before, it was being said such a person would come about and his time is almost coming nearer. So Ibn Khaldun knew about this and it caused him even greater fear. He kept thinking in his mind, this must be the guy. And how can I speak to him in a way that will help me escape this place in safety? So on account of my fears, he says, it occurred to me to tell him something by which he would be diverted and might become kindly disposed towards me. So I began to say, may Allah strengthen you. I have longed to meet you for 30 or 40 years. He's basically lying. He's basically lying, okay? So I've been waiting for you to meet you for 30 or 40 years. Then he says to him, there are two reasons why I've been waiting to meet you, O Timur. The first being that you are the supreme sovereign of the universe. Subhanallah. You are the supreme sovereign of the universe and the ruler of the world. And I do not believe that there has ever been a ruler like you among men from Adam to this point. So he's really overbaking the cake here. Yeah? He says, I've been waiting 40 years to meet you because you are the supreme sovereign of the entire universe and you are the ruler of the entire world and you are the best ruler. Ever since Adam to this moment in time, there's never been a ruler like you. Then he says, scholars in the past and present have all agreed that the most populous groups amongst human beings are the Arabs and the Turks. So now he's building another case. So not only is he appealing to his ego by telling him you're the greatest human being, the greatest ruler, the supreme of the universe and all of that, but he's touching upon the ethnic pride, saying that we all know, scholars of the past and the present all agree that the two greatest nations are the Arabs and the Turks. Of course, the Arabs, he's an Arab, and Timur is a Turk or Turkic. So he's trying to say, look, both of us, we're from great people. My people, your people, let's get together, right? The Persians fall utterly short of the Turks. So now he's again praising, saying the Persians, forget those guys. They fall short of the Turks. They're not as great as you guys are. As for Caesar and Alexander, the Romans and the Greeks, they were kings of the Greeks. But the Greeks cannot be compared with the Turks. Neither can Nebuchadnezzar. He was only a chieftain of the Babylonians and Nabateans. Yeah? So in other words, he's saying, yes, I acknowledge there are other great names, but they're nothing compared to you people, the Turks. Nothing compared to you. You are the greatest. Then he says the second reason why I've been wanting to meet you for so long is that I've heard from many saints and astrologers in the Maghrib that there would come, effectively the prediction that there would come a man who would be so powerful. He said that's the reason why I believe that you may be that man. So he was effectively praising him and stroking his ego. Yeah? Eventually, he gets what he wants. Ibn Khaldun is then released. He's allowed to go home. Timur is impressed with him, and he does not pursue anything against Ibn Khaldun. So Ibn Khaldun lives to tell the story, and he gives a very detailed account. It's a very concise account, but a very detailed. So this is why he will then, of course, tell us that in order to attain power, authority, and proximity, you have to be willing to compromise and to praise and to effectively brown nose. Yeah, and those who don't do that, who don't want to do that, They are people who will die in obscurity and who are effectively proud, and so on and so forth. So we will not go further into this because, again, it's a very lengthy, detailed discourse. But if you want to read it in your own time, I want you to take note of these references here, inshallah. In the Arabic, there are, well, just get the original Kitab al-Ibar. The entire section is there, and you can read it in Arabic. Otherwise, there is a translation in English, quite an old one, but it's still there. Ibn Khaldun and Tamerlane by Walter Fischel. Berkeley and Los Angeles publications. Ibn Khaldun and Tamerlane by Walter Fischel. Very detailed. Okay, very detailed. You can read how he goes about effectively praising Timur. And in the footnotes, he mentions that Timur is very ugly. Okay, so he admits, while praising him for being just praising him, he puts in a footnote, Timur is very ugly to look at, right? But that's not something you want to say to Timur in his face. So of course he will try to find other ways to praise him. Islamically, is that permissible? No. False praise is not permissible. Yeah, but that's the ideal of Islam. It should be like that. But in the political realms, it's not always like that. Yeah? There are various videos online you'll find. For example, Mobutu, President Mobutu, very, very extravagant ruler in Congo. He came after subhanallah, Lumumba, Patrice Lumumba. He came after him after betraying him, and he would have people praising him in courts, right? And it's on YouTube, the actual footage. They're praising him in courts. They call him the creator of heaven and earth, the conqueror of conquerors, the king of all beasts on land and in the fish in the sea. Ridiculous praise, and it goes on for a long time, right? I think I'll find the video, inshallah, I'll put in the group. But this was normal. You find it in other kind of regimes, even to now, where they begin to praise the rulers openly and very clearly lying and exaggerating. But this is how they go about effectively securing for themselves position and rank, but at times also to kind of save themselves from harm. So this is part of the political playbook. And of course, we do not praise that. It's not praiseworthy. It's not Islamic, in fact. It's not even ethical. But this is how things, unfortunately, operate at certain levels of power and authority. That's how they operate. And Ibn Khaldun is, you could say, is a prime example of that. Right, so we've come to the end of this session, inshallah. Let's take a bit of time. I want to hear from you in terms of what you've learned today. Do you agree, disagree? What are your first takes on what he's told us about power, about having to have people who can enforce social structure, and even praising rulers, as being something that should be done and not, we shouldn't try to shy away from that. What is your feedback as a group? What do you feel about this?
Yes, Assalamu alaikum. So in Islam, there's something called hawala, right? Basically, you say something, but you don't mean it. But it doesn't have to be a lie, you know?
Mm,
And saving one's life is very important, um, to a point where haram become halal just to amounts that can save your life, you know? So I'm not justifying actions of Ibn Khaldun with anybody, but if you're in a position where a tyrant, but like, after al-jihadi, man qala kalimatul haqqi عند سلطان الجاعي, right? أو كما قال عليه
mhm.
الصلاة والسلام.
Sallallahu alaihi wasallam.
Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wasallam, he understood that. He said that, saying a kalimatul haq in front of a sultan al-ja'i, a tyrant, is after al-jihad, right? So now I would say you have a choice. Either you save your life by doing tawriyah, like hawala, or you say kalimatul haq and become shaheed. I would say I will blame somebody who will do it. I put my judgments on it straightforward. I'll try to understand it. I will understand it from a Shari'i perspective.
But there must be a limit to how much you're willing to kind of, there has to be a
Of
limit.
course,
Yeah.
there's a boundary to it. Like you don't start lying. That's why we use the word tawriya, you know.
Yeah,
I mean,
Tawriya is to say something. Just to give an example, in Surah Yusuf, there's an example of Tawriya. Uh, so to say one thing, but you're not lying technically. It's just that if the person misunderstands it, that they can be given another interpretation of something. You're not lying to them, but you're just telling them something that could be misleading. That's Tawriya. And in cases where it's not the same as Taqiyya, very different, or Kitman is very different. Tawriya is a bit different. It's different. You say something, but it can be taken one way. For example, when Sayyidina Ibrahim says, "She's my sister." Yes, in humanity and in Islam, she is your sister. But in reality, or in the sense of what the king wanted to hear, is that she's my wife. But if he said she's my wife, he'll be killed. So he says she's my sister. It wasn't a lie technically, but at the same time, technically, she's not your sister. Yeah, that's Tawriya. So, I mean, we can understand that use of that. But what Ibn Khaldun does when he meets Timur is more than that, quite frankly. It's not just a slight, there's a bit more happening there. So, brother Abdullah,
Assalamu alaikum.
alaikum salam wa rahmatullah.
You mentioned something about Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam talking about how if you are like, I'm paraphrasing, but power hungry, or you intend to get power and it's like you want it versus someone just, having it given to them, that it's better to be like kind of given power than to just kind of want it and take it. But what would you say if someone maybe has the intention to like actually do good, and maybe they see themselves taking power to actually make a change, or it doesn't even have to extend to like a government or like a leadership position. It could be like a local organization. Is it always bad to be in power hungry or see yourself wanting power to actually make a change, or should we always kind of think that, obviously we should check our intentions, but where do you draw the line versus like someone who just wants power for the sake of power, or power because they genuinely think that they would use the power for good?
It's a good question. Some of the best rulers we had they actually shied away from power. They didn't want it when it was given to them, or it was given to them in a way that they weren't even aware of it. They weren't campaigning for it. Sayyidina Abu Bakr, radiallahu anhu, didn't campaign. He was just saying, no, Umar said, no, I select Abu Bakr. So he wasn't even asking for power. It just happened to fall upon him. Umar ibn Abdul Aziz, same thing. He never asked for it. He was elected to that position. And many other examples. It's very difficult, though, to actively seek power, because think about it this way. Which politician is going to say to you, I want power to be corrupt? No. They'll always tell you, we want power so we can help people. We want to help society. We want to help people get jobs. Everyone says that. If you want power, you're going to say that. Only you will know in your heart of hearts whether or not you intend to do that when you get into power or not. But at the same time, somebody may genuinely have the intention to be that way. But once you get into power, things happen. Things happen. Once you get into power and you realize you have power, things can happen. We've seen a recent case in Syria. It's still too early to judge, but we've seen how certain positions change when you're in power. How certain positions change in power. So it's very difficult to judge just because somebody said, I feel like I'll do something good. No, once you're in power, it's very different.
Mm-hmm.
Very different.
I have one more follow-up question. Basically, like we were talking about like Saddam and Gaddafi. Do you think they would kind of fall under examples of like being power hungry from the beginning, or do you think not just them, but can you maybe mention any leaders that kind of had good intentions and started out good, but then the power just kind of ended up corrupting them over time, and then they became something completely different?
The best example I can give you is Abdul Malik ibn Marwan. Abdul Malik ibn Marwan, the Umayyad king. Best example I can give you is Abdul Malik. He was a very righteous man, very knowledgeable man in Medina, one of the 7 most senior jurists in Medina. He was just an amazing human being, and he even afterwards he was amazing. One of the greatest khulafa we've had in the history of Islam. But before he became a Khalifa, he was a different person. When he became a Khalifa, completely different person. It's difficult to judge until the person is in a position of power. Difficult to judge how they'll act when they get that sort of authority. Most of these people in the recent times who have become, for example, Gaddafi, Nasser, Saddam, before they came to power, they were all talking of liberation and let's get rid of the old kings who are corrupt. We don't want Farouk, we don't want Idris, we don't want these kings who are corrupt. Then they get into power, and what happens? Yeah, what happens? So it's difficult to tell. It's just, put it this way. Somebody who doesn't have $1 million in their bank can tell you all day, if I had $1 million, I would help the poor people, I'd build a school, a hospital. If I had 10 million, I'd do this. Yes, it's possible, of course. But when a person gets $1 million, do they always do that? Sometimes. Yeah. But many times they think, oh, I don't want to lose $1 million. Let me invest it somewhere else quickly. Yeah, let me protect my wealth. Let me make sure it's not being taken. It's not going to lose value. When you get into a position of power, it's very different. Yeah, it's very different. So it's very difficult to say, well, I will do it for the right reasons, because you're not being tested with power. It's only when you get into a position that you realize whether or not you're going to abuse power or whether or not you're going to still remain principled. Yeah. So this is something that we cannot attest to unless we're in that position. And that's one of the reasons why we are told to make dua for those in power. Not just people in power in terms of kings and governments, not anyone who has an authority or responsibility. Make dua for them. Can be a manager, somebody who manages maybe a school, can be somebody who looks after a community, because it's a major fitna to be in that position. Major fitna. And many people are not tested with that fitna, so they don't know. It's easy for you to say, oh, this person made a mistake, I would never do the same thing as they've done. But put yourself in their shoes. If you had access to wealth, to powerful people, to many benefits and privileges, would you also remain patient with that? No. Sometimes people crumble, you know. So it's not possible to say it unless you're in a position to say it. I remember once we were studying Surah Yusuf in a circle, and the Sheikh said, when we got to the point where we were reading the chapter, the segment where the women gathered in the house and they began to chitter chatter, and then they saw Yusuf alayhi salam. وقلنا حاشا لله ما هذا بشر إن هذا إلا ملك كريم. So when they saw him, they couldn't even realize, they didn't even realize they're cutting their own fingers. But prior to that, they used to say, oh, Imratul Aziz, Imratul Aziz has fallen for a slave boy. And they used to mock her for that, because they never saw the boy. So they would mock her for that, that she's a loose woman, she has no self-respect. How could she fall in love with a slave boy? So she invited them, said, no, come to my house. Here's some fruit, here's some, eat, enjoy yourselves. And they were mocking her until she said, Yusuf, come out. And as soon as they saw the boy, or the young man, alayhi salatu wasalam, they lost their senses. And they said themselves, hasha lillah, ma hadha bashar, in hadha illa malakun karim. This is not a man, it's not a human being. This has to be an angel. And while they were saying that, they were cutting through their own hands, did not even realize they were doing that. Yeah. So what does that teach us? Unless you're in a position yourself, it's easy to say that person is weak, that person is corrupt, that person is so and so. But if you're in the position that they're in, you don't even realize what you would react, how you would react to the same situation. Those women realized that we judged her for something that we didn't know. And when we were in the same position as her, we did worse than she did, because we cut our own fingers. Yeah? So we make dua for people who have authority, power, fame. This is major, major fitna. Major fitna. And we don't call upon yourself, don't invite upon yourself that kind of fitna, because you never know. If you have that kind of authority and power, only Allah knows. how their personality would change. And Abdul Malik ibn Marwan is a perfect example of that. Perfect example of that. Brother Yunus.
Yes, Ustad, Salam alaikum.
Wa alaikum
So,
salam wa rahmatullah.
yes, so about the concept of Tawriya, so it's just to say that in the case of Ibn Khaldun, it's not done. I mean, the example you gave us at the end, it was done like to save his life, but he has done it like all his life for money, for success.
Yes,
So it's not really applicable here.
yes.
And
But
yes,
I agree with you 100%. As I said before, this is where we disagree with him completely.
yes,
But
exactly. Yeah.
he's working in a field where everybody's doing that pretty much.
Yes, and I'm coming to the other point. So how comes someone like Ibn Khaldun, he's so intelligent, doesn't he like talk about the Sahaba as-Salihin, for example? Like they did like the complete opposite of what he did in his life. So doesn't he like just touch about this subject, for example, in his Muqaddimah?
So he talks of the early generations as being different to everyone else. They were in a unique situation, their situation is pure. They were great human beings. They had a great tarbiyah. They had, something that could not be replicated in other times. He makes that
But it,
very clear early on, but he doesn't take them as an example. I know where you're coming from. He's not taking them as an example in this
yes.
field. In this field. In this field, he's trying to tell us about social science and how things work, and he tries to bring Quran into it. Allah says this, Allah says this, but Allah doesn't tell us to lie.
Yeah.
No, Allah doesn't tell us to lie.
And so about that, I mean, we have like some great example like Imam al-Ghazali radiallahu anhu. Uh, he did like the complete opposite, let's say. I mean, he was like in a great position. He had money, he had success, he had everything, and he just abandoned everything to like yeah to um, to work on himself and think deeply about those matters of life. So, and when I see like Ibn Khaldun, I think that the Muqaddimah, he wrote it after his family died. And when I see that even after like this disaster, he didn't like realize some important points in life, it just like strike me like how two men who had like quite the same not life but the same yeah the same position, the same success, the same money, let's say, the same kind of things like that. They they just finished like completely, they are the complete opposite of one and the other. So I would like your thoughts about this, Ustad.
Yeah, I mean, Ibn Khaldun is obviously is a lifelong bureaucrat. That's what he does for his entire life. This is why, I mean, you could have mentioned, for example, Abu Hanifa, Imam Malik, Imam Ahmed, Imam Shafi, all of them were people who stood up against the governments and spoke the truth. And as a result, all went to jail at some point. All of them. Some even died in jail. Abu Hanifa resisted working for the Khalifa, although he was called time and time again to be a judge, which should have been the same position as Ibn Khaldun. Abu Hanifa refused. He said, no, I don't want to be a part of the establishment because that requires compromise. Yeah? It requires compromise. You become somebody who compromises, who will say things to gain the pleasure or to gain advantages. And he says, I don't want to be part of that. He was right. It corrupts. Yeah. This is where we have to realize that even, I think one of the takeaways we can take from this is that even if somebody is very religious or very knowledgeable, it's still possible that when it comes to politics and political and powerful people, they can also be compromised. It's possible, it's potential. There are incidents that we've seen in recent times. I don't want to mention certain names, certain countries, but very, 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 very senior cleric supporting what is clearly incorrect, very even ethically, morally incorrect, supporting these actions from the military and the government, right? Even a child could tell you this is wrong, this is immoral, but it's possible, yeah, because they're in a circle of power, and that also can corrupt at times. So, if we can take anything away from that, is that it is possible at times, if you're in a certain power circles, it can have an impact on the sincerity and even sometimes the reliability of certain statements or certain rulings being made.
Yes,
That's
you
why we
said,
have, yeah.
yes, I understand that, but when I think about, he lost his entire family and he had like a crisis in life because of that. And I mean, it was like the perfect time, to take a step back about those things. But even then, he wrote the Muqaddimah like he did. So I don't know. It just happens like to kinda not shock me, but it's like striking me because, for example, like you said, some Umama or even Al-Ghazali, um, there were like just some principle or just some thoughts that made them like that created like a crisis, life crisis, if
Mm.
I can say. But in his case, it feels like a psychopathic in some way, like you said about Machiavelli, and it really feels like that when you see it like
It's the ugly face of reality. We have to face some of these realities have to be faced. It's the ugly face of reality, and these are things that obviously it's a part of life in certain circles. It's just the way things are. The majority of people in that position crumble. If you look at, for example, the Mihna under the Abbasid Khulafa, Imam Ahmed, rahimahullah, was one of a few people. I think Yahya ibn Ma'in and Imam Ahmed were the last men standing after a long time. Many of the scholars stood down because they couldn't take the persecution, the torture. So they stood down. They just said, okay, we agree with what you said, the Quran is created. Yahya ibn Ma'in and Imam Ahmed were the last men standing. And when Yahya ibn Ma'in couldn't take it anymore, only Imam Ahmed was left. Huh? So we could say, well, I would die for Islam. I would say that Quran is not created. I would suffer the consequence. But in reality, if you're facing torture, imprisonment, and whatever else comes with that, uh, sometimes you have to realize that human beings are human beings. Human beings are human beings, and in positions where they feel threatened or they feel that their interest can be, they can gain something. Some human beings are willing to bend, the truth or compromise the truth just to obtain a bit of benefit and advantage. It's a reality. It doesn't mean everyone, but it means that it's a reality that we have to pay attention to. Where I do feel that Ibn Khaldun's advice has to be completely rejected is when he begins to say that those who actually have the courage to speak the truth and to not flatter and to not fall into deception, he tries to paint them off as being arrogant people, people who are proud, people who think they're better than others, people who will die poor. I disagree with that completely. I think this is unnecessary, and it is trying to undermine what should be actually elevated. That okay, maybe I compromised, but it would have been better if I did not compromise. That would have been a better way of presenting it. But trying to make the other people who actually make the sacrifice look like they are actually arrogant people who are haughty, who don't have the ability to make the right decision. That's where I find this very, very problematic and should be rejected completely. Yeah. Because it's not a matter of either compromise or die. It's not that way all the time. Sometimes you speak power to truth. You speak truth to power, and it benefits you. Ibn Taymiyyah, for example, rahimahullah, would speak to the Mongol commanders the truth, and they respected him for that. They respected him for that because he was willing to tell them the truth and without sugarcoating. Now, of course, he did compromise certain things, but he wasn't willing to just lie to them. He told them the truth, and they respected him for that. He was able to be firm and principled. So Ibn Khaldun is just a human being, like all human beings. He has brilliant takes and brilliant insights, but also he has certain aspects of his outlook that has to be questioned, if not even rejected outright. Brother Sufyan.
Can you hear me?
Very well, very well.
Yes. Jazakallah khair. So, according to Ibn Khaldun, like the culture of being obedient to your rulers, respecting them, and supporting them, this is closer to the Islamic way, and it provides stability. And in the West, we have this culture of, spitting on the rulers, disrespecting them, making funny memes of them. But why do you think it's still more likely that the Muslim world, Arab world, they're more likely to revolt against their ruler than anyone in the West? Because you hardly see anybody out here, despite all the jokes, complaints, nobody does anything. Is the missing factor here the pay, the money people receive, the quality of life, benefits, etc.?
Good question. Does anyone have an opinion on that? Does anyone have an opinion as to why, as our brother mentioned, where there is typically very, very tight control and reign over what people can say publicly and what they can do, they're the most likely places to have revolutions against their rulers, as opposed to where it's very open. You can insult the president, the king, but there's no revolution. Just speak. You don't have to raise your hand. Just speak,
Because
inshallah.
you hardly hear anybody do anything here, despite,
Well, they tried. They
what they
tried to
say.
storm. They tried to storm the I forget what it's called, the building in America. It was a couple of years ago.
They did that, but it was nothing
Yeah.
like it's nothing like what you would see in Syria and Libya. You won't see anybody take arms and do nothing.
Well, didn't they shoot?
Brother,
Didn't they shoot
uh,
Trump recently in the air?
yeah, they did. Yeah.
Yeah.
I will
I mean,
say,
they did.
sorry, I will say it's depend on like Muslims are by fitra, we're ahli nazariyat. We believe in Jannah, we believe in Akhirah. So the death is like, another step for us to go to a Jannah. If somebody can convince me, if I do X and Y, I'm in a haq, I will do anything. And Western peoples, even they themselves say they are like Catholic Christians or anybody, but they don't have the guts. Like if we're gonna look at the Yahud, they are the most scariest people to die. Like if Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala say if we were to give them another 10,000 years to live, they still want more. So they love the materialistic world. That's one point. Another point is they don't have courage to do it. Like the Western government is so smart, it suppress their populations to a point. It just like like even if I have to call them like a tiger, but they don't have a teeth and a claw to bite and like repel themselves. They're in a zoo, very, very, very tame. They're just like a cat in a house. What can a cat do to the owner? Scratch it, make some scratch. But
Mhm.
in other hand, Muslims, we're fitratan, we have these ideological beliefs. We believe in akhirah, right? So now we have concept of like basically. I'm just saying from experience. This is how I see things in like when we revolt, like things were would take very thing very seriously. That's
Brother,
that's my
yeah, I agree with you. And just to jump on this point, there is the courage point that you said. There is the fact that they are Muslims, and I've lived in half of my life, let's say, in a Muslim country, and half of my life in the West. And what I see is that in Muslim countries, they understand the what the governments like are playing, what's behind the scenes, let's say. But in the West, the population is really like naive. They're trusting everything on the television and let's say the general zeitgeist. They go with it like without questioning it. But in Muslim countries, it's the contrary. They are like really critical, and they are like let's say they don't trust. They don't trust like let's say the government, and they always question things. So there is that for me at least.
I think we would have to put quality of life in there as well. Like there's a reason why in certain countries like Saudi or UAE, Western people, we're like, why does nobody speak against anyone in the Khalij, the rulers, the kings? Because I believe those citizens, they're all living like kings themselves. Well, many of them. So they have a less of an incentive to go against, their kings. But in Syria, they were living like very low like quality of life in Libya. So I think this also plays a factor in combination with everything you guys said before.
Does anyone want to have another opinion on that?
Yeah, I was gonna say a few things. First of all, Ustad Ibrahim, as you explained, almost every single revolution is organized from behind. And typically, the people who revolt are the people who have seen the precedence of success of the previous revolution. So, to me, it looks like no revolution is spontaneous. There is always interest group. There's always force behind even the so-called revolutions. And I think Sister Hafsa just put a note saying that it doesn't happen in the West because CIA doesn't do it. So there's a truth to it. Many so-called coups, revolutions, turns out were supported by foreign powers such as CIA and whatnot. Especially in autocratic countries, to organize groups and to rebel is very difficult because every single person doubts the other person. There's a lot of suspicion. There's a lot of conspiracy. So this is why I don't think organic revolution is natural. We have to be very careful when we ascribe rebellion or rebellious culture or psyche to our people. Thank you.
I would say that I would disagree with that premise because the worst and most bloody revolutions came from the West. The worst and most bloody revolutions came from the West. And they are the most likely to actually revolt. So, as we know, the very famous, it's not a hadith, it's like an athar, that the Romans, the Europeans, have qualities. One of the qualities, they don't allow themselves to be oppressed by kings. They don't allow themselves to be oppressed by kings. The most bloody revolutions, the Bolshevik Revolution, the French Revolution, they were in the West, the American Revolution, and it was so bloody and so devastating that I think people know that yeah, we can speak against the rulers badly, but we don't want to go that far. Because when they have revolutions, it shifts everything. We have revolutions in the Muslim world, and it only changes maybe the government for maybe 10, 20, 30 years. It doesn't change, it doesn't shift the culture to such a degree. When the Europeans and the West have a revolution, the entire culture shifts. Everything shifts. The way of life, everything shifts. The last revolutions they've had, the church was completely kind of detached from society. Everything changes. So I think because the consequences are so much greater when the Western societies have revolutions, there are less of them. But they are still very rebellious. They're more rebellious than any Muslim country. They just understand the consequences that come with raising arms. Yeah. But also, as our sister mentioned very, very well, we the Muslims are not busy planning revolutions in the West, for example. But almost all the revolutions in the Muslim world in the last 150 years, to some degree, if not entirely, was planted by CIA, MI6, external agencies. So it's not always that we organically have these. No, it's because there is agency coming from external sources, forcing or helping or planting, sowing seeds of discord to make it such that we revolt or we have support to revolt. So there is espionage and sabotage there as well. I'm not blaming the West. I'm not trying to know. It's a reality. It's a reality. Even when people are living a certain lifestyle, which is not necessarily the most advanced, economically speaking, they're able to continue living that life. But it is when external agencies come and say, no, you need to revolt, or they plant revolutions. For example, in 53, 52, Mossadegh in the 50s, Mossadegh in Iran. That entire revolution was actually planted by CIA. and made to look like an authentic revolution. It wasn't. The Arab Spring, at the thick of it all, we saw Google training young people to use social media to spread the message, right? So there is a lot more than just Muslims revolting and taking arms and being prepared to die. I think it's a very different ball game. When revolutions happen in the West, everything changes. Everything changes. It's not just a matter of government. Everything changes, right? So it's a good thing they don't have too many revolutions. Let's put it that way. So that's what I think anyway. Does anyone agree or disagree with the idea that a healthy society is one where there is someone above forcing people to comply, to cooperate, even if it may be not necessarily the best approach? Do you think, or do you believe that it is somewhat useful to have strong men, as they say, to rule society?
I agree. Honestly, I could use a more contemporary example, like in South Africa, for example. We all know that even in before 1994, there was the apartheid, and there was forced segregation, with all these different groups of people separated by force. And after apartheid, to get them to start working together, the government had to implement it by force because there was separation by force. And now there had to be implementation by force because naturally, after you segregate people for that long and you create animosity like that, the only way you're going to get them together is to force them. And I have another example in Singapore. For example, it's one of the most economically developed countries in the world, and it's very diverse, and the government enforces that diversity because they don't want to create like ethnic tensions. So there's quotas for how many people have to of certain ethnic groups like Indian, Malay, Muslim, Chinese have to live in an apartment. They have to live together because naturally, if they don't enforce that, you're going to start seeing divides and people maybe persecuting one group. So yes, to get to your question, it's good and it's necessary, not in all circumstances, but in many circumstances.
Those are great examples, Barakallahu fikum. But you can also say, as we've seen in America in recent years, that should also include sexual preference, for example, just as an example, that we should force people to be more inclusive and more tolerant. If we don't do that, they're going to be intolerant and they will not incorporate other communities. So, as you said, it depends on the circumstance, I guess. It can be a force of good to have that kind of governance from above that will enforce certain principles, but it can also swing the other way, right? It can be the other opposite. For example, when somebody wants to impose democracy on the people, and they don't want to be democratic, but no, we want you to have democracy and freedom. We want your women to have no hijab, and we want you to be able to speak English like us. That can be a problem as well. So I guess it depends on the circumstance and situation. But generally speaking, personally, I think it's a good thing to have some sort of uh, authority that can override the individual's sometimes flair that they want to do everything they want to do in their way. Sometimes it's good to have a rule that says no, you don't get to do what you like. An example of that is Sayyidina Umar ibn Khattab radiallahu anhu. When prior to his Khilafah, Sayyidina Uthman radiallahu anhu wanted to expand Masjid al-Nabi, al-Nabawi, and he would actually invite people who owned land and property to give up their land and property so he can expand the masjid. And they were very insolent against him. They would tell him to his face, "Who do you think you are? Taking our land and our no, we will not give you our land. By Allah, we will refuse your order." Right? No, actually Uthman came after, radiallahu anhu. But Sayyidina, in the time of Sayyidina Abu Bakr, Umar, he would take the land after giving them the option to say either we pay you for the land or we take it. And on one instance, a man said to him, I will not give you my land. So Sayyidina Umar said, then I'll take it. I'll take the land and put you in jail. So he was forced to comply. So when Sayyidina Umar died, when Sayyidina Uthman radiallahu anhu became Khalifa, they began to reject his offer. And he would tell them, You are only doing this to me because you know I'm more lenient, but you would never have dared to do this with Sayyidina Umar. That's an example of you need to have sometimes people who are strong-handed to force the people to behave. If you just leave the people to their own whims and desires, they will not see the greater good.
But
So that's an example of that having been the case. We can look at Russia. For all that we can say about Russia, some people admire Putin because he's willing to stand on certain principles and he leads with a strong kind of uh, a firm fist, effectively. And some people see that as a good thing, that you need to have someone at least that people are afraid of, at least they can respect enough to take his directive and judgment on certain issues. Again, these are things that I think it depends on the circumstance, but generally speaking, it's not necessarily a bad thing, in my opinion. I think it depends on the circumstance. Brother Hamza, Brother Yunus.
Yeah, Ustad Ibrahim, I was going to say about the benefits of benevolent dictatorships. I guess to me, it looks like if you have a dictatorship, the society can all move in one direction, um, for the better or for the worse. Let's say in the case of for the better, it will galvanize society in one direction. And on the opposite, if you look at so-called democracies, before they became market economy based developed democracies, they were all um, colonial powers. They got resources through dictatorship of colonial power over colonized people. So I guess the reason why the Western powers keep pushing for democracy in the developing nations is perhaps they want to keep us unorganized. Always there's always change of power, change of direction, and that could be it. So I was going to say dictatorships in general are a good force, and we have to look at the trajectory of the past 1400 years of Islamic rule. You can start from the Umayyad dynasty all the way to the Ottomans. They were all dictatorships to some extent.
That's an interesting take. So you think there can be such a thing as a benevolent dictatorship?
Yeah, look at the UAE, look at Qatar, look at the GCC nations, right? Monarchies, they were able to move and change the countries dramatically. I'm talking about economical, not all spheres, but economically, compared to Republican systems like social Ba'athist, Iraq, Syria, Misr, right? All of them are now trailing behind the monarchies. Monarchies are stable, predictable, and even the investors, they want stability and predictability if they want to make investment to a certain market.
That's interesting. That's interesting. By the way, we will cover it in future sessions, where Ibn Khaldun actually talks about he goes into further detail as to what happens when people are not kind of are given the right to do what they like, and when they're not given that. He believes personally that you should have effective dictatorship, right, in society. Otherwise, people just do what they like, and it becomes a nightmare for everyone. So
mm,
interesting, Brother Yunus.
yes, Ustad. So I agree with the point Brother Hamza just said about the fact that markets give more stability and long-term, let's say, goals and achievements, which democracies don't generally. But I wanted to come back to what you said about Uthman radiallahu anhu. Did he do that was it like injustice or
Did he take the buildings, the land?
yes, yes,
No, so basically, with every subsequent Khalifa, there was a need to expand the Haram because there's more people, there's no space, right? Even till this day, by the way, in Mecca, they keep expanding, right? Every time they keep expanding and they take the land from people and they compensate them. So Umar was the
yes,
first person to do that. So he did that, but he gave options first to buy
yes,
the property, and then if they didn't do it, he put them in jail anyway. Took the money, took the property. So when Sayyidina Uthman came and he wanted to expand, they used to say to him no. They defied him.
yes,
But he wasn't somebody who was going to force. But he recognized that the only reason why you don't want to obey me is because you know you're not
mm-hmm,
facing Umar ibn Khattab. Yeah, that's why you're doing this. In other words, he
Yes,
wasn't forcing them to comply, and that causes death because eventually what began to happen is people began to uh, take it for granted. They began to complain about him. They forged letters. They started signing things in his name. They were
yes,
complaining,
yes.
petitioning, and he refused to really kind of crush these people to the very end, but it cost
So,
him his life.
yes, so Ustad, I mean, we want a strong ruler, but not an unjust one, right? Because to come back to this precise example, I know that Sayyidina Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, um, when Fatima radiallahu anha and Sayyidina Ali radiallahu anhu wanted to move to become his neighbors, he had like to ask the person who owned the land to give him like just another like small part of the land. So if the Rasul Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam did that, how comes we would just accept the fact that we just can take like someone's land just like that for free? Not for free, but I mean forcefully. I mean it can't be right.
But what happens, as Ibn Khaldun says, he says that the individual may not know what the best, the greater benefit is for society. Could you
Yes,
imagine if
understood.
the people in Mecca
Yeah,
said, "No, we don't want to expand. We don't want to give our land."
understand.
Yeah,
Yeah.
how do we accommodate 2 million
But
people every year?
the way I see it, there are like limits, and those limits are like made from Allah, and we can see Subhanahu wa Taala, and we can say the example of the Prophet Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam.
Sallallahu Alaihi
So
Wasallam.
if we go like further than that, it shouldn't be like permissible, even if like the ruler says that he understands better than anyone. Like those are like the let's say the excuses to put haram things, for example, in societies like what happened, let's say, in the 20th century with the riba, which has become like just a normal thing in the Muslim world. Even in Mecca, you can get like loans, as far as I know. Things like that, alcohol, drugs, I don't know, a lot of things that were not like permissible, but it has been like introduced under this excuse. So isn't that like a gate for that, Ustad?
I mean, to be somebody who actually has authority, you can't always. Uh, I mean, the ideal is there, but it's it's very rare you find somebody who's able to apply everything 100%. As he says, sometimes the evil is there. You have to accept it because it's part of the package. You can't, if you were to respect everybody's rights 100% in that sense, many things would be impossible for the greater good. You would not be able to do certain things for the greater good because somebody could say to you, but principally speaking, I'm not allowed to maybe hold on to my land, but we need to expand there are certain things that becomes difficult. And you need somebody strong enough to say, actually, even though it may not be ideal, you need to follow the order that I give you. You need to obey me in this for the greater good. And we find it sometimes, as he says, you don't see the good until it's been forced upon you. You see the good later on. Yeah.
I
It's
mean,
just
Ustad,
it's
well,
difficult to
I I guess what how I see things is that we can't know. I mean, if something is haram or halal, we can't like sometimes we can't see like the greater goods in the
yes.
end. You know what I mean? Maybe it will be like in one century. Maybe it will be like you said about Uthman radiallahu anhu. Maybe if he didn't do that, he would still live. You know, and there won't be like a Battle of Siffin, like we said. There won't be like all this fitna and what happened like for more than a millennial, yeah.
Yeah, millennia.
So that's what I guess my idea is that we maybe we can see this greater good.
Yeah, I mean, take an example of Sayyidina Ali radiallahu anhu who comes afterwards. his army, actually, when it's a great example here because when he came to power, straight after Sayyidina Uthman, radiallahu anhuma, what did people say to him? What was the general consensus that people wanted from Sayyidina Ali as soon as he came to power? What did they want him to do?
To kill the person, the responsible of
Yeah,
the killing of Hajman.
they wanted him to seek retribution and redress for what had happened. And now, principally, is that correct? In principle, is it correct that they should have demanded that these people be put to trial and executed?
Yes, and he wanted to do
Yes.
that, but not right away, let's say.
Yeah,
So
but
yeah.
he had to tell them no. I'm not
Yes,
gonna
you
do
said,
it. Yeah,
but he was in the right here. It was
he
not like something un-Islamic or something unrightful.
no,
So
he was in the right, but those who went to war against him or who criticized him used the Quran to say that you're not in the right because you are delaying justice and you're using man-made laws, whereas Allah has already given us guidance. So according to their perspective, from their interpretation, he was doing haram. Yeah? But he had to force that opinion that say no, and I'm willing to go to war in that case. To if that's what it takes, he had to do that. You're going to just say, okay, I'll just give in because people are pressuring me. I'm going to do what people want me to do. He said, no. The greater good in this case is not to immediately take action. Let's take a bit of time to stabilize society, to consolidate the ranks. Once we have stability, now we can act upon it. Yeah. He had to make that. It's a very, very difficult decision to make
but I
because the
mean,
people, yeah.
yeah, Ustad, I mean, when it happened with Sidna Ali radiallahu anhu, and Muawiyah said, I mean, he came with this excuse. It was like more an excuse than anything. We agree about that. He said that his main motivation is that Uthman radiallahu anhu was like from his family. So I mean, the interpretation of the Quran, it's an excuse more than anything. It's just a political excuse, like we are like saying about how to excuse haram things. So
But
that's how I see it.
that came from the army of Sayyidina Ali, his own soldiers, his own Shi'at Ali, the
Oh,
initial.
Khawarij.
Yeah, they're the ones that said
Yeah.
no.
Oh, yeah, yeah.
You're doing the wrong thing. We need to seek retribution first before anything else. Before you do anything else, the first thing you should do is seek retribution. But he was strong enough and wise enough to say no. This is not the best thing to do right now. Yeah, but that took a lot of strength to do
Yes.
because he had a lot of pressure. So if he was weak or he was just permissive to say, okay, I'll just do it because you said to do it, what could have happened in our society? You know, he had to. It was a difficult situation.
Yes, I agree with that. I agree with the fact that the leader should be strong, but I mean, bending the sacred rules, I mean, that's where like I put the limits for me. That's where like
They do it all the time. If you look at, for
yeah, I
example, the
understand that too.
The Ottomans had the fratricide, where clearly it's haram to kill an innocent person, but at some point it became state policy. They had to do it because to avoid too many civil wars. That's how they operated. Yeah. It's not ideal, it's not good, it's not even moral, but sometimes certain things are done because of necessity, just for the greater good. And again, when you're in a position of power, with all that is at stake, sometimes you make less than ideal decisions to safeguard the greater good. The evil is still there, but the good outweighs it. That's why it's us, people who are not in positions of leadership to that level, we have to try to understand sometimes. Just try to understand sometimes. Just try to just understand sometimes that, okay, it might look a certain way from where I'm standing because I'm at a position where it has no
Yes.
consequence on me. But
Hmm.
try to be a bit more understanding sometimes about how it may feel to be in that position, to be under stress and duress.
Yes, yes. Ustad, I mean, yes, then I completely agree with that. It's like the way I see it, it's like someone, let's say someone who drinks or someone who does zina, for example. I can understand, I can understand in the way that maybe his past made him like do that, and now he's like addicted. And but I can't say that it's something that is normal, that we should do that, that it should be like normalized. I can understand that, and I can like I won't judge him, let's say. But in in the same way, we can't just normalize it. That's I think that's how I see it, at least.
I mean, it's good. I think it's good discussion to have because sometimes we have the wrong uh, priorities. Let me give you an example. Most of us who live in the West, I'm just talking from experience, we have a difficult time when it comes to certain injunctions in the Quran, which are very clear. Clear haram is completely haram. When I say this is haram, if you do this, you're going to be in big trouble with me. And we still do it, right? And then we find excuses for why we do it. Survival, if we don't do it, we're going to be homeless. You know what I'm talking about, right?
Yes, al-kamal.
Yeah.
Yes.
So, but why are we doing it? So many of us doing it because in the position we're in, some of us may believe that it's the only way. Okay, it's a haram, but if I don't do this haram, then I'm gonna face difficulty elsewhere. So we find a way to justify the action because it's a matter of survival, right? So we do it individually, sometimes in matters that are not a life and death situation because we feel it's a necessity. So imagine managing an entire nation. Sometimes you have to make decisions that are not ideal, but it could appear to be a lesser evil compared to what could be a greater evil. It's just complicated. It's just complicated. At that level, it becomes very, very complicated. And it's easy to say, oh, this is a mistake, they're making a mistake. But sometimes you have to just kind of try and be a bit more empathetic and think, how would it feel? How could it feel to be in that position? Which is having the position of Ahmed Shara, for
Mm-hmm.
example, in Syria. You come to power suddenly. Your nation has been under tyranny for 50 years. And suddenly, somehow, whether supported by a Western agency, whether not supported, whatever the situation is, you're in power, and you have the opportunity to bring peace and tranquility in your own country first before exporting it elsewhere in your own nation. And you have people saying to you, you have brought peace and tranquility back to this nation. But then you also have people saying to you, no, you need to continue. You don't stop here. You need to export this to Palestine, for example, support the brothers there. Don't stop now. You need to move on straight away and deal with the issue over there. Right? It's difficult because, again, before becoming the leader, maybe it was very clear and simple. We're going to fight oppression everywhere. We will never stop until we win. But once you get into the position of power, there are a lot more things to consider now. Yeah? It becomes more difficult. So now you have to talk about being inclusive of Christians, right? And making sure that minorities are allowed to practice their faith openly. So now you have to talk about being more diplomatic, having foreign connections with certain nations, because the situation now has changed. But we who are watching, we can always say, oh, you compromised. You should have been straight. Don't compromise. Continue fighting. Allah will help you until you become somebody in that position. And you have to think about the greater good. So it's not black and white. It's very difficult. When Abdul Aziz, King Abdul Aziz ibn Saud of Saudi Arabia, spent 30 years, 30 years, from 1902 to 1932, 30 years, fighting, struggling to obtain a position of authority in that region, Hijaz. 30 years. In 1929, when it was very clear that he was basically going to be the sovereign of the Hijaz, very clear, a faction from his own army, Al-Ikhwan al-Man Ata Allah, his private militia, began to criticize him for not going far enough. They said, you didn't go far enough. Why do you want to stop at these borders? You need to go into Kuwait, you need to go into these regions, and you need to spread the da'wah beyond just this region that you've conquered now. And furthermore, we don't like your attitude. You're becoming more westernized. You're becoming more permissive. You're not hardcore enough. You're not spreading the da'wah properly. So this group became problematic. Eventually, he had to crush them. He had to crush them. He
Mm-hmm.
had to crush them, right? Because if he didn't crush them, they are jeopardizing the entire project. He had to crush them. So that's a reality. They fought together for so long, but beyond a certain point, there has to be a decision made, you know? Who's in control here? And what's the greater goal? He was only happy to conquer that region. He didn't want to be a Khalifa. He didn't want to be a Sultan. He didn't want to be unifying. He just wanted to conquer the region in the Hijaz that was of interest to him. That's all he wanted to do. But when he attained that, they said, no, we want to go beyond that. So now, is he a bad ruler for crushing them? Did he do the right thing to crush them? Or should he have been more patient? Should he have been more receptive? Should he even listen to them? That's a question to ask. Yeah. He made a decision that can be considered treacherous. He killed his own people who supported him, and they are also Muslims, because they wanted the Sharia to be expanded further, the da'wah to go further. He killed them. Did he do the right thing or wrong thing? If you look at the overall result of his actions, it wasn't a failure, because he still has the kingdom. The kingdom is still there. They're still in a position where they're prospering. They're still among the most stable nations in the Muslim world. Did he make a bad decision? Was he a bad ruler? These are the questions that are very difficult to answer. Yeah. So,
Ustad Ibrahim, I have a question if you don't mind.
of course you can. Bismillah.
You've been saying the power structure is such that it is what it is. There is no good or bad in terms of how you come to power. Once you come to power, then you are in power. It's very descriptive. Do we have a prescriptive model in Islam whereby if we have to, we can take down people like Yazid II, who openly, violated the injunctions of Islam? I argued earlier about the virtues of dictatorship, but how do we make sure that when this dictatorship turns into evil, how do we stop it? Does Islam offer solutions?
When the Prophet ﷺ says, if you have two rulers, and you have one ruler, and another person comes along and wants to be a ruler at the same time, that you should eliminate the second person. It's a very famous statement, right? If there's one person in power already, and the second person comes along and wants to contest or wants to be in power at the same time, the Prophet ﷺ says, eliminate the second person, kill them. Yeah, kill them. There's no discussion here as to which one is more pious. It doesn't say if a wicked person comes along and wants to take over a position, no, it doesn't say that. It's just a matter of if there is an order in place and somebody comes along to upset the order, you need to eliminate the person who's coming to upset the order. Yeah? It doesn't mention whether they're more righteous or not. Because the greater good here is in establishing a system whereby there's one ruler, there is unification and order, and not to jeopardize it for anything. That's the reason why when Yazid was in power, those who tried to resist him, and they did try, but it resulted in what? Harra. The people of Medina, the vast majority, stood up and rebelled against Yazid. They tried, and it resulted in Harra, unspeakable horror and evil. Likewise, the people of Mecca tried to rise up again, and what happened there? They were besieged by Hajjaj, unspeakable horror and evil. So as far as we're concerned as Sunnis, it's not worth the squeeze. It's not worth it. It's not worth it. And we've seen time and time again, Ahlul Bayt, the descendants who have tried to rise up against the Abbasids and the Umayyads, were crushed. So because of that reality, the conclusion therefore is preserve the greater good. Preserve the greater good. Yeah? Because we know what happens when you try to go against it. And if the people in power are not people who are principled enough to care about the rules anyway, you already have a disadvantage, because they're not going to play by the rules. They're not going to play by the rules. So it doesn't seem to be something that is favored or not the first, unless there is no alternative whatsoever and this is the only way. That's very different. And even there, the scholars tell you, the Sunni scholars, only if you can guarantee success. If you know that this will be successful, go and do it and complete the job. But if you know, or if you feel that there is a potential that you may fail, then you're better off not starting to begin with. Yes, Brother Yunus, we'll stop after 5 minutes, inshallah. Brother Yunus, I think your hand's up.
Yes, Ustad, maybe it will be controversial question,
No
but
problem.
yes. So you talked about Imam Ahmad that he was the only one who stood his ground about the Quran. So
In the end,
yes, in the end. So my question, like, see, it's kind of linked to that and what you just said. So the Sunni, let's say the Sunni tradition, it was like uh, it was born, let's say, in the Umayyad slash Abbasid periods, right, Ustad?
yes,
So
developed.
related to what we said about Imam Ahmad and the Quran, if this happened, so at uh, at which degree, let's say, the Umayyads influenced, let's say, the Sunni position about those questions, you know?
Well, I mean, the first instance is very clear because you can see the Battle of Harra was a very, very, very important historical event because it changed everything, literally. Yazid and his rule changed everything, but the Battle of Harra and the siege of Mecca changed everything because this was when it became very clear. And then, of course, before that, there was Karbala, the massacre of Karbala. So these were instances that made it very clear that the consequence for going against certain powers, established power, were very real. And these are not people who cared about the sanctity of Mecca Medina. They didn't care about the sanctity of Mecca Medina. They were willing to go and catapult and rape and loot and pillage. They were willing to do that to maintain power. So that's why the Sunni scholars said, let's be a bit more pragmatic here. Let's have certain rules and certain principles to ensure that we don't fall into these mistakes again. Sayyidina Abdullah ibn Umar was very consistent. He said to people in Medina, do not rebel. Don't do it. It's not worth it. Don't do it. I know Yazid is such a person. I understand, but don't do it. It's not worth it. You have to be patient. Yeah. That was a learning point, a moment that we have to remember forever what happened in Harra and also straight after Mecca. So we can either go for the principle of we will fight injustice or we will. And it's not to say that Muslims, especially Sunni Muslims, just go along and obey every fajr and tyrant. That's not what it means. It's not to say that. It just means that you have to realize that these people, they are in position, they have an authority and they have a recognized position. But at the same time, there's also a reality when you go against these people. There's a reality that has to be acknowledged. You know, if you do rise up and you want to challenge the authority, there are consequences. You know, sometimes the consequence is not worth the effort. If it's a failed revolution, you may find yourself in very, very deep waters. What we saw in Syria up until recently was a result of a failed revolution. So many millions of Syrians had to leave their land, right, and had to be dispersed all over the world because the revolution failed. Okay, now it succeeded now, but look how long it took and how many people had lost their lives, had lost their families, had to leave their country. A very high price to pay. Yeah, very high price to pay. So it's just understanding that, you know, the issue of leaders and rulers and it's a necessity. It's a necessary evil in certain instances. It's a necessary evil. But it's not something that we can always kind of measure against the highest forms of, you know, the virtues we hold as Muslims to be truthful, honest, kind, benevolent, to not be corrupt, to not be wicked. These are things that we, of course, we aspire towards. But at the state level, uh, it's not always necessarily something that we will see and we should expect. Unfortunately, unfortunately, that's not the case always, all the time. And you find, for example, even Saddam, we know Saddam did many bad things, but some people will say, okay, but you know, at least he helped Palestinians. At least he stood up against America. At least. So even there, the jury is not really necessarily clear. So you say, okay, he did bad things, but he also did some good things. Yeah, it becomes difficult at that level. So we just have to keep that in mind, inshallah. But in conclusion, this was just a summary of Ibn Khaldun's perspective. Some things are valid and interesting. Others are not necessarily something that we should be aspiring to do. We shouldn't be using flattery, deception to gain power or to gain authority and influence. This is not something that is Islamic or even moral. But it's in his book. So we acknowledge that, but we have to also, keep in mind that he's a human being and he also had his own circumstances. But in many ways, it's also reality that some people do that. Some people operate that way, and they succeed and they thrive in position because they're willing to do that. But it's just something that, again, when we look at governments, you look at rulers, you look at establishments, just keep it in mind that these are very different levels. They operate on different rules at times. And as he mentions, there is good that could still be there, but it's mixed with a lot of evil, sometimes evil that cannot be mitigated. So when you measure the good and the bad, don't focus too much on just the bad, because if you do that, there's a risk there. Look at the good as well. Also look at the good, that if the ruler is corrupt, if the ruler is somebody who, there was a very interesting interview with Prince Bandar. He's dead now, Prince Bandar, and his son is an ambassador of Saudi Arabia to the UK. Actually, very eloquent man. But Prince Bandar said on camera, on record, that yes, so what? There are some government agents or some government people who are embezzling funds. Okay, sometimes it happens in our government. People steal money or they embezzle funds. So what? He said, so what? Even though we have that in our society, sometimes some people do that. Nevertheless, do we not have hospitals? Do we not have schools? Do we not have infrastructure? Is the economy not growing in Saudi Arabia? This was back in the, I think, early 2000s, after 9/11. He said, so what? Because there are other nations where there is wealth, there are resources, but there is no infrastructure. There is no reliable system. There is little employment. So between these two options, where you have a government that does have a bit of corruption, but they still deliver generally, and one that is corrupt completely, which one would you prefer? So I found it very interesting the way he said it, because he's not saying we are free from corruption. He's saying we have corruption. It's natural. But so what? Because in a grand scale of things, people still get what they need. They're still in a country that's peaceful, that's prosperous, that's growing, and they have access to resources. Don't expect perfection in everything. Now, principally, you could say, well, actually, why should we tolerate corruption of any sort? Principally, yes. But realistically speaking, again, if you measure the good and the bad, if there is more good, sometimes focus on that, or at least make it something that is part of your criticism. Acknowledge the good as well. Don't just focus on the bad.
Once your work is finished, don't watch the television. Once your work is finished, find something constructive to add to your mind. Have an hour for reading. And I don't mean read comic books. Read something that will make you know what's happening. So when you get in a conversation, you can sound intelligent, even if you aren't.